Welcome back to Quiet Chronicles. If you're new here, settle in. This is the place for long, unhurried history, told slowly enough to carry you towards sleep rather than keep you from it. Wherever you're listening from tonight, let yourself arrive there fully. Maybe you're already lying down, lights off, the day finally behind you. Maybe you're still finding that position you'll drift off in, shifting once more before stillness takes over. There's no rush tonight. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they've been holding tension. Let your breathing slow on its own without forcing it. Nothing in the next few hours needs anything from you except your presence, half here and half already leaving. Tonight, a 14-year-old girl arrives in Russia. She cannot speak the language. She has no allies, no fortune, no claim to anything. She is married off to a boy who prefers toy soldiers to the wife beside him. And somehow, from that starting point, she becomes the woman who seizes an empire by force and reshapes it for 34 years, leaving it larger than any ruler before her ever managed. If Quiet Chronicles has become part of your nights, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd guess, and sharing it with someone who also struggles to wind down means a great deal. For those who want to support the channel further, there's a Patreon link waiting in the description. Her name was Sophie once. Tonight we find out how she became Catherine. Chapter 1: A Minor Princess. Stettin sat cold and gray along the Oder River, a garrisoned Prussian town more accustomed to soldiers than to royal announcements. In the spring of 1729, inside a modest house near the town square, a girl was born to a family whose title far outweighed its fortune. Her father held a respectable military post, but no great estate came with it. The birth itself drew little attention beyond the household. Nobody watching that morning could have guessed what the child would become. Her father was Christian August, a prince of the small German house of Anhalt-Zerbst, and a career soldier before he was ever anything else. He served the King of Prussia as a garrison commander, a job that paid steadily but never lavishly. Duty mattered more to him than ambition, and he approached his daughter's upbringing with the same disciplined plainness he brought to his regiment. He was honest, unshowy, and largely absent, called away often by the demands of his post. The girl grew up more familiar with his correspondence than with his presence. Her mother was a different kind of force entirely. Johanna Elizabeth had married beneath the connections she felt she deserved, and she never fully let go of that grievance. Her own family ties ran toward grander houses, including relations who sat close to the thrones of Sweden and Russia. She measured her worth by the company she kept and the marriages she might still engineer for her children. A daughter, in her calculations, was less a child to raise than a piece to place well. The girl was named Sophie Friederike August, though nobody in the household expected the name to carry any particular weight. She was not the son Johanna Elizabeth had wanted, and she felt that preference early, long before she had words for it. Her mother's attention went first to a younger brother, doted on and coddled in ways Sophie rarely experienced herself. What Sophie received instead was distance, dressed up as discipline. She learned to read that distance accurately and to work around it. Stettin itself was no glittering capital. It was a working town, its skyline shaped by fortifications rather than palaces, its streets filled with soldiers rather than courtiers. The Anhalt-Zerbst household occupied a respectable but unremarkable position within it, neither poor nor especially privileged. Sophie's early world was small, practical, and thoroughly provincial. Nothing about the surroundings suggested that a future empire was quietly assembling itself in one of its children. What Sophie lacked in maternal warmth, she made up for through an early, restless curiosity. She asked questions that unsettled the adults around her, questions about power, about kings, about why some families ruled and others merely served. A visiting tutor once remarked that she thought like someone twice her age. Her formal education was ordinary for a princess of her rank, covering French, religion, and deportment. Beneath the surface of that ordinary curriculum, something sharper was already forming. Her governess, a Huguenot woman named Babette Cardell, shaped her more than any relative did. Cardell was intelligent, plain-spoken, and unwilling to flatter a child simply because she was high-born. She introduced Sophie to literature and history well beyond what court etiquette required. Sophie adored her and later credited her with teaching the habits of mind that would define an entire reign. It was an unusual bond for a minor princess to form with a servant, and it left a permanent mark. Physically, Sophie was an active, sturdy child, more comfortable climbing and running than sitting properly for portraits. She had little patience for the delicate posturing expected of aristocratic girls. Her mother frequently scolded her for behaving like a boy, a rebuke Sophie absorbed without much visible remorse. She preferred motion to stillness and questions to obedience. Even in small ways, she was already resisting the shape her family wanted to press her into. Family visits were where Johanna Elizabeth's ambitions became most visible and most transactional. Relatives with royal connections were treated as opportunities rather than company. Sophie was paraded before them with careful attention to posture and manner, evaluated the way a merchant might evaluate goods. She understood, even as a child, that these gatherings were auditions. What she was being auditioned for was not yet clear, only that it mattered enormously to her mother. One of these relatives was of particular interest, a young cousin from the Duchy of Holstein-Gottorp, connected by blood to the Swedish throne and, more distantly, to Russia. His name was Peter, and he was sickly, awkward, and largely uninterested in the company of other children. Sophie met him briefly during one of these visits, without any sense of what that meeting would eventually mean. At the time, he was simply another relative to be polite to. Neither child understood the weight the encounter would carry later. A family story, retold more than once as Sophie grew older, claimed that a fortune teller had once examined her palm and predicted a crown in her future. Whether the story was true or invented after the fact hardly mattered to how it functioned within the household. It gave Johanna Elizabeth something to repeat at gatherings, a flourish to attach to an otherwise unremarkable daughter. Sophie herself seemed to take the prophecy half seriously, the way children often do with stories told about them. It planted an idea that refused to fully leave. Money was a persistent undercurrent in the household, discussed in careful, controlled terms befitting a family determined not to appear diminished. Christian August's military salary covered the essentials, but little beyond them. Expensive gowns and lavish entertainments were simply not available to the Anhalt-Zerbst family in the way they were to grander courts. Sophie grew up understanding, without anyone stating it outright, that appearances required more effort than resources. That lesson in improvisation would prove useful decades later in a much larger palace. Religion occupied a formal, unremarkable place in her upbringing, Lutheran in name and observance rather than in fervor. Sunday routines were followed dutifully without the theological intensity found in some households. Sophie absorbed the outward habits of faith more than any deep conviction. This mattered little in Stettin, where religious identity was simply inherited along family lines. It would matter enormously later, once a crown intervened and required a very different church altogether. Sophie's brother, favored so openly by their mother, died in childhood, an event that reshaped the family in ways nobody spoke about directly. Johanna Elizabeth's grief was severe, prolonged, and impossible to hide from the household. Sophie, still young, absorbed the aftermath without fully understanding it. The dynamic between mother and daughter did not soften afterward, despite the loss. If anything, Johanna Elizabeth redirected more of her ambition, rather than her affection, toward the daughter who remained. By the time Sophie reached her early teens, her mother's letters to distant relatives had grown more pointed, more clearly aimed at securing an advantageous match. Marriage, for a girl of Sophie's rank and modest fortune, was the primary currency available to her. Beauty helped, connections helped more, and Johanna Elizabeth worked both angles with persistence. Sophie was aware of these efforts and largely powerless to shape them. Her future was being negotiated in letters she was rarely shown in full. None of this unfolded with any sense of destiny at the time, only with the ordinary grinding logic of aristocratic survival. Minor houses like Anhalt-Zerbst depended on strategic marriages to maintain relevance across generations. Sophie was simply the next asset in that long-running strategy. She had no army, no wealth, and no independent claim to anything resembling real power. What she had, instead, was an unusually sharp mind housed inside a body her mother was actively marketing. Far to the east, in a court Sophie had never seen and could barely imagine, decisions were already being made that would reach back towards Stettin. The Russian Empress Elizabeth was searching for a suitable bride for her nephew and heir, the same sickly cousin Sophie had once met in passing. Connections, religion, and political convenience all factored into that search. Anhalt-Zerbst, small and unassuming as it was, happened to fit several of the requirements quietly circulating through Elizabeth's court. Nobody in Stettin yet knew how close that search had come. The girl who would become Catherine spent her earliest years, then largely unnoticed by history, shaped by an absent father, an ambitious mother, and a governess who taught her to think for herself. She left no early mark on the wider world, no signs legible from a distance. What she carried instead were habits of observation, patience, and quiet self-reliance, cultivated long before anyone thought to record them. Those habits would matter far more in time than any title she was born without. Stettin gave her almost nothing to start with, except the sharpened attention of a child who had learned early to watch closely and say little. Chapter 2, Sent to Russia. The letter that changed Sophie's life arrived in Stettin with none of the drama such letters are supposed to carry. It came from Empress Elizabeth of Russia, inviting Johanna Elizabeth and her daughter to travel east, ostensibly for a private visit. Everyone involved understood what the invitation actually meant. Elizabeth was searching for a bride for her nephew, and Sophie had passed whatever quiet vetting process had taken place beforehand. The invitation was less a request than a summons dressed in polite language. Johanna Elizabeth reacted with barely contained triumph, the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching a long campaign finally bear fruit. She began preparing for the journey almost immediately, arranging clothing, letters of introduction, and travel routes with meticulous care. Secrecy mattered enormously to the arrangement, since a failed match would embarrass both families involved. Sophie, only 14, was told relatively little about the stakes involved. She understood only that something significant was happening and that her mother's mood had shifted entirely. Winter travel across northern Europe in 1744 was neither comfortable nor safe, and the journey to Russia tested both women severely. Roads froze and thawed unpredictably, carriages struggled through mud and ice in turn, and the cold settled into the bones in a way that no amount of blankets fully solved. Sophie fell seriously ill partway through the trip, feverish and weak for days at a stretch. Her mother pressed forward regardless, unwilling to let illness delay an opportunity this rare. Recovery came slowly and largely through Sophie's own stubborn constitution rather than any particular care. Crossing into Russian territory meant crossing into an entirely different world, one governed by unfamiliar customs and an unfamiliar language. The scale of the country alone was disorienting, distances measured in weeks rather than days. Sophie had grown up in a modest German garrison town, and nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of what she was now entering. Villages grew sparser, forests grew denser, and the sense of arriving somewhere vast and half-known deepened with every passing mile. Her arrival at the Russian court came without much time to adjust to any of it. She was presented quickly, examined carefully, and measured against expectations she could only partially guess at. Empress Elizabeth watched the introduction with the practiced eye of a ruler evaluating a political instrument rather than simply meeting a potential relative. Sophie's appearance and manner were noted, discussed, and ultimately deemed satisfactory. The scrutiny was constant, and she was rarely allowed to forget it. The boy she was meant to marry, Grand Duke Peter, greeted her with the same detachment he seemed to bring to most things. He was Elizabeth's nephew and heir, brought from Holstein as a child, and never fully at ease in his new country. Illness had left him weakened, and a bout of smallpox had scarred his face and damaged his confidence further. He showed little interest in Sophie beyond polite formality. Their reunion, years after their brief childhood meeting, carried none of the warmth such reunions are supposed to carry. Peter's own history explained much of his strangeness, though understanding it did little to ease Sophie's situation. Taken from Holstein young, he had been raised amid constant upheaval, tutors dismissed, expectations shifted, affection rationed carefully by those managing his upbringing. He clung to toy soldiers and military games well past the age when such things are usually set aside. Sophie noticed this immediately and filed the observation away without comment. It would not be the last time his behavior struck her as unsettling, rather than merely eccentric. Language became Sophie's first serious battleground at court, and she approached it with unusual intensity. Russian bore no resemblance to German or French, and she pushed herself to learn it far faster than court etiquette required. She studied late into the night, occasionally slipping out of bed in the cold to review her lessons rather than sleep. Illness returned during this period, likely worsened by exhaustion and the harsh climate, yet she pressed on regardless. Her effort was noticed, and it earned her early, quiet respect from those who observed it. Conversion to orthodoxy loomed early as an unavoidable requirement, one Sophie approached with more pragmatism than personal turmoil. Marrying into the Russian throne meant abandoning her Lutheran upbringing entirely, a demand that some foreign brides resisted bitterly. Sophie did not resist. She studied Orthodox theology with the same discipline she brought to language lessons, determined to perform the conversion convincingly rather than reluctantly. Her willingness pleased Elizabeth considerably, and it set her apart from the visible discomfort Peter still showed toward his own adopted faith. The formal conversion ceremony took place with considerable ceremony, marking the moment Sophie Friederike August became Ekaterina Alexievna, known thereafter as Catherine. She recited the required declarations in Russian without visible hesitation, a detail that impressed observers used to foreign brides stumbling over unfamiliar words. The name change was more than symbolic. It marked a formal severing from her old identity, replaced by one built specifically for the role she was being prepared to occupy. Her mother, meanwhile, was proving to be a liability rather than an asset within the delicate political environment of the Russian court. Johanna Elizabeth involved herself in intrigue, corresponded with foreign diplomats in ways that aroused suspicion, and generally failed to grasp how closely her behavior was being watched. Elizabeth's patience wore thin steadily. Catherine, increasingly aware of her mother's missteps, began quietly distancing herself from Johanna Elizabeth's schemes. The daughter who had once been managed so tightly was learning, in real time, how to manage herself instead. Isolation defined much of Catherine's early experience at court, despite the constant presence of servants, tutors, and officials around her. She had no real friends yet, no established allies, and a fiancé who showed her little warmth. Letters home offered some comfort, though even those were monitored closely by people loyal to Elizabeth. Catherine adapted by turning inward, observing the court's rhythms and rivalries with careful, patient attention. She was, in effect, teaching herself the political terrain long before anyone expected her to need it. Elizabeth's own temperament shaped the atmosphere of the entire court, unpredictable, extravagant, and quick to punish disloyalty. She ruled through personal favor as much as through formal structure, elevating and discarding courtiers according to shifting moods. Catherine studied this pattern closely, recognizing early that survival at this court required reading Elizabeth's temperament as carefully as any written law. Flattery worked, but only when it appeared effortless. Catherine practiced that particular skill relentlessly until it no longer looked like practice at all. Formal engagement to Peter followed once the conversion and language requirements had been sufficiently met, though little about the arrangement resembled romance. It was announced as a political milestone, celebrated with the appropriate ceremony, and treated by nearly everyone involved as a matter of state rather than affection. Catherine performed her role adequately during the celebrations. Privately, she had already begun to suspect that whatever awaited her in marriage would have very little to do with companionship. The wedding itself was still ahead, but its shape was already visible in how the engagement period unfolded. Peter remained emotionally distant, more absorbed in his private amusements than in the young woman he was set to marry. Catherine, for her part, continued sharpening the skills she sensed she would need regardless of what her marriage became: languages, observation, patience, and careful self-control. She had arrived in Russia as a foreign girl valued mainly for her bloodline. She was leaving that arrival period as someone considerably more calculating and considerably more prepared. Word of the upcoming marriage spread through European courts with interest, some of it favorable, and some laced with skepticism about the obscure German princess now bound for a Russian throne. Few outside the immediate circle expected much from her beyond producing an heir. Catherine's own ambitions, if she voiced them at all, remained carefully hidden behind performed obedience. She understood already that visible ambition in a foreign-born bride would be treated as a threat rather than an asset. Better, she had decided, to be underestimated for now. What Catherine carried forward from this period was not affection for Peter, which never developed, but a hard-won fluency in the language, religion, and unspoken rules of her new country. She had converted, adapted, and endured illness and isolation without breaking under any of it. The marriage ahead promised little warmth, and she seemed to sense that clearly. What she was building instead, quietly and deliberately, was the foundation for surviving a court that rewarded cunning far more reliably than it rewarded love. Chapter 3: A Marriage of Silence. The wedding took place in the late summer of 1745, staged with all the pageantry the Russian court could produce for an occasion of state. Bells rang across St. Petersburg, crowds gathered to watch the procession, and Empress Elizabeth spared no expense on the celebrations. Catherine wore silver brocade heavy enough to strain her shoulders through hours of ceremony. Peter stood beside her through the ritual with visible boredom rather than any trace of nerves. Neither of them, watching the spectacle unfold around them, seemed to believe it had much to do with their actual lives. Life after the wedding settled quickly into a pattern neither romantic nor especially eventful. Peter retreated into his private amusements almost immediately, uninterested in spending time with his new wife beyond what ceremony required. Catherine, for her part, found herself with a title but no real companionship to accompany it. The palace was full of people, yet she often felt entirely alone within it. Marriage, she was discovering, had changed her circumstances without changing her isolation. Peter's habits grew stranger rather than more mature as the months passed, revealing a man deeply unprepared for the role awaiting him. He kept toy soldiers arranged across tables and floors, staging elaborate mock battles late into the night. He drilled servants like troops, and once reportedly held a mock court martial for a rat accused of eating a toy sentry. Catherine watched these episodes with a kind of detached bewilderment. She was married to the heir of an empire who seemed, in many ways, still a child playing at war. Physical intimacy between them was minimal and, by most accounts, largely absent for years. Historians have debated the precise causes, ranging from Peter's possible physical condition to simple mutual disinterest. Whatever the reason, the marriage produced no children for nearly a decade, a fact that worried Elizabeth considerably. Catherine bore the pressure of childlessness publicly, even as the private reasons behind it remained murky and unspoken. The absence of an heir cast a long shadow over the early years of her marriage. Court gossip filled in the gaps left by the couple's silence, some of it cruel and some merely curious. Catherine's fertility, her fidelity, and her suitability as a future empress were all discussed openly by courtiers eager for material. She learned to endure this scrutiny with practiced composure, refusing to let visible frustration undermine her position. Reacting emotionally, she understood, would only confirm whatever unflattering narrative was circulating that week. Silence, she decided, was safer than any defense she might offer. Loneliness pushed Catherine toward books in a way that would define the rest of her life. She began reading voraciously, working through works that ranged far beyond what court education typically offered a young noblewoman. Montesquieu's writings on law and government captured her attention early, offering a vocabulary for thinking about power she had never encountered before. Tacitus followed, his histories of Roman emperors giving her a framework for understanding ambition, cruelty, and the mechanics of rule. Reading became less a pastime than a private education she was constructing entirely on her own. Voltaire's writing reached her soon after, and it struck her with particular force. His wit, his skepticism toward inherited authority, and his insistence on reason over superstition matched something already forming in her own temperament. She read him not as idle entertainment, but as a kind of intellectual companionship her marriage had failed to provide. Years later, she would correspond with him directly, but even at this early stage, his ideas were shaping how she viewed the court around her. Books, in the absence of people, became her most reliable relationships. Her reading habits were not universally welcomed at court, where intellectual women were often regarded with suspicion rather than admiration. Some courtiers viewed her growing library as an eccentricity at best and a subtle threat at worst. Catherine learned to keep much of her study private, discussing it selectively and only with those she trusted. She understood instinctively that appearing too clever could be as dangerous as appearing too ambitious. What she read in private, she rarely displayed in public. Elizabeth's court operated on constant surveillance, and Catherine's household was no exception to that rule. Servants reported her habits, her visitors, and her moods to those higher up the chain of loyalty. Privacy, in any meaningful sense, barely existed within palace walls. Catherine adapted by becoming extraordinarily careful about what she revealed, even in supposedly private conversations. She was learning, slowly and deliberately, how to exist inside a system built to watch her every movement. The isolation of her marriage pushed Catherine towards select friendships and eventually romantic relationships outside her marriage entirely. Discretion mattered enormously in a court this attentive to scandal. She cultivated a small circle of confidants she believed she could trust, though even those relationships carried constant risk. Betrayal was always possible, and she knew it. Still, the alternative, total isolation, felt unsustainable for a woman still only in her 20s. Elizabeth's mounting frustration over the lack of an heir added pressure Catherine could not simply read her way out of. The Empress needed a successor to secure the Romanov line, and Peter's evident disinterest in his wife complicated that need considerably. Conversations behind closed doors grew more pointed regarding the couple's private life. Catherine found herself navigating an impossible position, expected to produce an heir within a marriage that offered almost no intimacy. The politics of her body had become, quite literally, a matter of state. Peter's interests continued drifting further from anything resembling preparation for rule. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia with an intensity that unsettled many at the Russian court, given the tension between the two nations. He dressed his household guards in Prussian-style uniforms and modeled his private military games on Prussian drills. Catherine observed this admiration carefully, recognizing early how poorly it might sit with a Russian public wary of foreign influence. It was, in its own way, another lesson in how a ruler could misjudge the loyalties of the people beneath him. Meanwhile, Catherine's own reputation among certain courtiers began to shift, slowly from curiosity to quiet respect. Her fluency in Russian, her careful manners, and her visible intelligence distinguished her from the awkward foreign bride some had expected. She cultivated relationships with officials and officers whenever the opportunity allowed, always with careful subtlety. These connections meant little immediately, but they were being built for reasons she could not yet fully articulate. Even in isolation, she was constructing a network. Her letters home to her mother grew less frequent and less warm as the years passed, reflecting a relationship that had cooled considerably since arriving in Russia. Johanna Elizabeth's earlier interference had left lasting damage, and Elizabeth's patience with the mother had long since expired. Catherine increasingly saw herself as independent of her mother's ambitions, capable of navigating the court without that guidance. It marked a quiet but significant shift in her sense of self. She was no longer simply her mother's carefully placed asset. The years of marital silence took a toll that Catherine rarely displayed openly, though her private writings later revealed considerable anguish during this period. She described feeling trapped, watched, and profoundly alone despite being surrounded by an entire court. Her intellectual pursuits offered escape, but they could not fully substitute for genuine companionship. Still, she pressed forward, refusing to let despair visibly interfere with the composed image she presented publicly. Endurance, more than happiness, defined these years. By the early 1750s, the pressure surrounding the succession had grown severe enough that solutions, however uncomfortable, began quietly circulating within the court's inner circle. Elizabeth's desire for an heir outweighed any concern for how that heir might actually be conceived. Catherine, aware of the mounting scrutiny, understood that her position depended entirely on resolving the childlessness that had defined her marriage so far. What followed would require decisions she could not have imagined making as a 14-year-old girl arriving in Russia. The marriage of silence was about to produce, at considerable cost, the child the empire required. Chapter 4. The Birth of Paul. By 1752, the question of Catherine's childlessness had become too urgent for the court to leave unresolved any longer. Empress Elizabeth's patience had thinned considerably over the preceding years, and whispers about the succession had grown louder among officials who depended on a stable Romanov line. Catherine understood the stakes clearly. Her position at court, however carefully cultivated, rested ultimately on producing an heir. Without one, even her intelligence and adaptability might not be enough to protect her. Historians have long debated the exact circumstances surrounding Paul's conception, and the ambiguity itself says something about the secrecy Catherine had learned to maintain. Some accounts point to Sergei Saltykov, a young courtier who had grown close to Catherine during this period of marital isolation. Others suggest Elizabeth's own involvement in arranging the situation, prioritizing the empire's need for an heir over any concern for propriety. Catherine's later memoirs offer hints rather than certainty. What remains clear is that the paternity of Paul, her first child, was never fully settled beyond dispute. Saltykov himself was handsome, charming, and well connected within court circles, qualities that made him a plausible companion for a woman as isolated as Catherine had become. Their relationship developed quietly, shielded as much as possible from the constant surveillance surrounding her household. Whether Elizabeth actively encouraged the arrangement or simply chose not to interfere remains uncertain. Discretion mattered enormously either way. A scandal involving the future empress could destabilize the succession as thoroughly as childlessness itself. Catherine's pregnancy, once confirmed, brought immediate relief throughout the court, regardless of the private questions surrounding its origins. Elizabeth's mood shifted noticeably, her anxiety over the succession finally easing after years of mounting frustration. Catherine herself experienced the pregnancy with a mixture of physical difficulty and emotional distance from those around her. She had achieved what the court demanded of her. Whether she felt any personal joy in the process is far less clear from the historical record. Paul was born in September of 1754, in a birth that Catherine later described as isolating rather than celebratory. Almost immediately after the delivery, Elizabeth took the infant into her own custody, removing him from Catherine's care entirely. This was not an unusual practice for a reigning empress determined to control the upbringing of a future heir. Still, the separation devastated Catherine in ways she rarely discussed openly. She had endured pregnancy and childbirth only to be denied any meaningful role in raising the child she had produced. Elizabeth's decision reflected both dynastic caution and a genuine distrust of Catherine's judgment regarding the empire's future. The empress intended to shape Paul's upbringing personally, surrounding him with tutors and attendants she selected herself. Catherine was permitted only limited formal visits, structured more like audiences than a mother's access to her son. This arrangement persisted for years, leaving Catherine emotionally distant from the child whose birth had secured her position. The bond between mother and son, weakened from infancy, never fully recovered. Catherine's own writings from this period reveal a woman navigating grief privately while maintaining composure publicly. She described the physical recovery from childbirth as difficult, worsened by the immediate separation from her newborn son. Loneliness, already a defining feature of her marriage, deepened further during this time. Yet she understood, with characteristic pragmatism, that visible distress would serve her poorly at a court that rewarded control over vulnerability. She grieved privately and functioned publicly, a pattern that would recur throughout her life. Peter's reaction to Paul's birth was notably detached, consistent with the general disinterest he had shown toward Catherine throughout their marriage. He showed little curiosity about the child, and some accounts suggest open doubt about his own paternity, voiced carelessly among courtiers. Whatever his private feelings, he made no serious effort to involve himself in the infant's upbringing. Elizabeth's total control over Paul made such involvement largely irrelevant regardless. The child existed for Peter more as a political fact than a personal one. Court intrigue surrounding the succession only intensified once an heir was secured, rather than settling into any predictable calm. Various factions began positioning themselves around different outcomes, weighing Peter's evident unsuitability for rule against Catherine's growing reputation for competence. Some officials quietly speculated about futures that bypassed Peter entirely. Catherine, aware of these conversations even when she wasn't directly part of them, absorbed every detail she could. The birth of an heir had not simplified the political landscape. It had merely added a new piece to an already complicated arrangement. Catherine's political education accelerated sharply during this period, shaped less by formal instruction than by careful observation of the maneuvering around her. She studied how alliances formed and dissolved within Elizabeth's court, noting which officials held genuine influence and which merely appeared to. Access to information became a currency she began collecting deliberately. Conversations that once seemed like idle court gossip now struck her as data worth analyzing. She was building, piece by piece, an understanding of power that no tutor could have taught her directly. Her relationships with key figures at court grew more strategic during this time, extending beyond the personal connections that had once simply offered companionship. She cultivated ties with military officers, foreign diplomats, and court officials whose loyalty might prove valuable later. These relationships were not romantic in nature, though some overlapped with earlier personal attachments. Catherine understood that influence required more than charm. It required a network of people who owed her something or believed they might benefit from her rise. Elizabeth's health, meanwhile, had begun showing signs of decline that would eventually reshape the entire political calculation surrounding the succession. The Empress suffered from various ailments that periodically confined her and fueled speculation about how much longer her reign might last. Catherine watched these developments carefully, aware that Elizabeth's death would trigger Peter's accession, regardless of his evident unfitness for rule. Planning for that eventuality, even quietly, had become unavoidable. The question was no longer whether change was coming, but how it would unfold once it arrived. Paul's early years passed largely outside Catherine's direct influence, raised according to Elizabeth's preferences rather than his mother's. Catherine's visits remained limited and formal, offering little opportunity to shape the values or temperament of the boy who would eventually inherit an empire. This distance troubled her, though she rarely voiced the frustration openly given the political risks involved. She recognized that challenging Elizabeth's authority over Paul would accomplish nothing beyond damaging her own position. Patience, however painful, remained the only viable strategy available to her. Additional pregnancies followed in the years after Paul's birth, though not all resulted in surviving children, and questions about paternity persisted around these as well. Catherine's personal life remained complicated by the ongoing absence of any real intimacy with Peter. Her relationships outside the marriage continued discreetly, managed with the same careful attention to secrecy that had characterized Paul's conception. Court gossip inevitably swirled around these matters, though Catherine had grown considerably more skilled at deflecting scrutiny. She had learned, through hard experience, exactly how much discretion her position required. The broader political environment surrounding Russia during these years added further complexity to Catherine's calculations. European alliances shifted, and Russia's own foreign policy grew increasingly entangled in the rivalries between Prussia, Austria, and France. Peter's open admiration for Frederick the Great placed him at odds with the direction much of Elizabeth's court favored regarding Prussia. Catherine paid close attention to these tensions, recognizing that foreign policy disagreements might eventually widen the gap between Peter and the officials who would determine his fitness to rule. Even distant conflicts, she understood, could shape the path toward her own future. By the later 1750s, Catherine had transformed considerably from the isolated young bride who had arrived in Russia over a decade earlier. She had secured the succession, built a network of useful alliances, and sharpened a political instinct that rivaled and, in many ways, exceeded that of officials twice her age. Her marriage remained hollow, and her access to her own son remained restricted. Yet within those constraints, she had become someone increasingly difficult to underestimate. The girl once valued mainly for her bloodline had become a woman actively shaping the terrain she would eventually need to seize. Chapter 5: Empress Elizabeth's Death. Elizabeth's health had been declining for years, but by the final months of 1761, the decline had become impossible for the court to ignore. She suffered increasingly severe episodes, confined to bed for stretches that grew longer each time. Physicians attended her constantly, though their remedies did little to reverse the underlying deterioration. Courtiers began speaking in careful, hushed tones about what might come next. The question was no longer whether the Empress would die, but how soon and what would follow. Catherine watched these developments with the same careful attention she had cultivated throughout her years at court. She understood better than most what Elizabeth's death would mean, since it would place Peter directly on the throne. His temperament, his admiration for Prussia, and his general unsuitability for rule had long worried officials who valued Russia's stability. Catherine kept her own opinions largely private during this period. Open speculation about the succession, however justified, carried real risk for anyone caught engaging in it too visibly. Elizabeth died on December 25th, 1761, after a reign that had lasted 2 decades and reshaped Russia considerably during that time. Her death triggered immediate mourning across the court, formal and elaborate in the manner such occasions demanded. Peter's accession followed without contest, since his position as heir had never been seriously challenged. He became Tsar Peter III almost immediately. What awaited Russia under his rule, however, few could predict with any confidence. Peter's early actions as emperor confirmed the worst fears many officials had quietly held for years. He withdrew Russian forces from the ongoing war against Prussia, abandoning hard-won gains that Russian soldiers had died to secure. Frederick the Great, whom Peter idolized without reservation, benefited enormously from this abrupt reversal. Military officers who had fought and lost comrades in that campaign felt the decision as a personal betrayal. Peter seemed entirely unconcerned with how this move was perceived among the very people whose loyalty he needed most. His admiration for Prussian military style extended well beyond foreign policy, shaping how he treated the Russian army itself. He dressed guard regiments in Prussian uniforms, replacing traditions that soldiers had worn with pride for generations. Prussian drill methods were imposed with little regard for how deeply this offended Russian military culture. Officers who objected found themselves sidelined or humiliated publicly. The Imperial Guard, a force that had helped install emperors before, watched these changes with growing resentment. Religion became another arena where Peter alienated support rapidly and carelessly. He showed open disdain for Orthodox rituals that Elizabeth had observed carefully throughout her reign. Plans reportedly circulated regarding reforms to church property and practice, threatening interests the Orthodox clergy had guarded for centuries. Catherine, by contrast, had converted sincerely and performed her religious duties with visible respect. The contrast between husband and wife on this matter alone did considerable damage to Peter's standing among the pious and the powerful alike. Peter's personal conduct as emperor did little to improve matters, marked by erratic behavior that unsettled even those inclined to support him. He drank heavily, mocked court ceremony that Elizabeth had maintained with careful formality, and treated officials with open contempt during public gatherings. Foreign diplomats reported his behavior back to their own courts with a mixture of alarm and disbelief. Even allies found themselves embarrassed by conduct that seemed to actively invite ridicule. 6 months into his reign, Peter had managed to offend nearly every institution capable of protecting him. Catherine's position during these months grew increasingly precarious, despite her outward composure. Peter had made little secret of his interest in a mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, and rumors circulated that he intended to set Catherine aside entirely. Divorce, or worse, remained a real possibility given Peter's evident disregard for consequences. Catherine understood that her survival now depended on more than patience. Passive endurance, which had served her for years, was no longer sufficient given the direction Peter's reign was taking. She began cultivating relationships with military officers more deliberately during this period, aware that the Guard's loyalty represented the single most decisive factor in any future crisis. Grigory Orlov, an officer of considerable charm and influence within the Guard, became particularly important to her efforts. His brothers held additional sway among the regiments, giving Catherine access to a network she had been quietly building for years. These relationships were personal as well as political, blurring lines in ways that suited Catherine's practical approach to alliance building. She was assembling piece by piece the foundation for something she had not yet openly named. Peter's insults extended even to his treatment of Catherine in public settings, a recklessness that shocked observers accustomed to at least the appearance of imperial dignity. At one formal dinner, he reportedly humiliated her openly in front of assembled guests, calling her a fool within earshot of foreign dignitaries. Such displays did nothing to strengthen his position and everything to generate quiet sympathy for Catherine among those who witnessed them. She endured these humiliations with practiced composure, giving no visible sign of the calculations already forming beneath her calm exterior. Every insult, absorbed silently, deepened the resolve she was keeping carefully hidden. The nobility, meanwhile, watched Peter's erratic governance with mounting unease that extended well beyond military and religious circles. Economic policies confused merchants and officials alike, implemented and reversed without clear explanation. Foreign policy decisions seemed driven by personal admiration rather than national interest, a distinction that mattered enormously to those responsible for Russia's broader standing. Confidence in Peter's judgment eroded steadily across nearly every sector of court and government. What had once been private grumbling was becoming, by the spring of 1762, something closer to open discontent. Catherine's allies grew bolder as Peter's missteps accumulated, sensing an opportunity that would have seemed unthinkable only months earlier. Conversations that had once remained cautious and indirect became more pointed, more explicitly focused on alternatives to Peter's continued rule. The Orlov brothers moved through Guard regiments with growing confidence, gauging loyalty and building support quietly. Catherine remained careful about her own visible involvement, aware that premature exposure could destroy everything before it began. She let others test the waters while she continued projecting patience and restraint. Peter's plans to divorce Catherine, whether fully formed or merely rumored, added urgency to the calculations already underway among her supporters. If he succeeded in setting her aside, her position, and possibly her safety, would be entirely at his mercy. This threat clarified the stakes considerably for those already inclined to act against him. Waiting indefinitely was no longer a viable option. Something would need to happen, and it would need to happen soon, before Peter's intentions hardened into action. Foreign observers stationed in St. Petersburg noted the shifting mood with increasing interest, sensing that Peter's reign might not last through the year. Reports sent back to European courts described a ruler alienating nearly every group whose support he required. Catherine's growing popularity, by contrast, drew favorable comment even from diplomats who had once dismissed her as a minor political figure. She had spent years cultivating an image of competence and restraint. That image was now paying dividends precisely when she needed it most. By early summer of 1762, The atmosphere within the Guard regiments had shifted from grumbling discontent to something considerably more active and organized. Catherine's supporters had spent months building the relationships necessary for decisive action, testing loyalties, and identifying which officers could be trusted completely. Peter remained largely oblivious to the extent of the danger gathering around him, absorbed instead in his own amusements and his open contempt for Russian tradition. He had inherited an empire and, in less than a year, had managed to alienate nearly everyone capable of protecting his hold on it. The stage, though he did not yet realize it, had been set for his removal. Catherine understood the risks involved in what was approaching, risks that could end in exile or execution, rather than the throne she had spent 17 years quietly preparing to claim. She had converted her religion, learned a foreign language, endured a loveless marriage, and absorbed humiliation after humiliation without ever losing sight of her position within the court. Peter's failures had created an opening that patience alone could never have produced. What remained was a question of timing, nerve, and the loyalty of soldiers she had spent years courting carefully. 6 months into her husband's disastrous reign, Catherine was no longer merely surviving the Russian court. She was preparing to seize it. Chapter 6: The June Coup. By the final days of June 1762, the conspiracy surrounding Catherine had reached a point where discretion could no longer hold it together indefinitely. Peter had left St. Petersburg for his estate at Oranienbaum, unaware of how quickly his position was unraveling in his absence. The Orlov brothers had spent months preparing the Guard regiments for exactly this moment. Word could arrive at any time that the plot had been discovered. Everyone involved understood that hesitation now carried more danger than action. The trigger came on the night of June 27th, when one of the conspirators was arrested under circumstances that suggested the plan might be unraveling. Alexei Orlov, moving quickly, rode through the night to reach Catherine at Peterhof before dawn broke. He woke her directly, informing her that further delay could prove fatal to everyone involved. Catherine dressed hastily and departed with him almost immediately. There was no time left for careful deliberation. The moment she had spent years quietly preparing for had arrived without warning. Their journey back to St. Petersburg was tense, covered quickly by carriage along roads that offered no guarantee of safety. Catherine's mind, by her own later account, moved rapidly between fear and a strange, clarifying resolve. She understood precisely what failure would mean: exile at best and execution at worst. Yet turning back offered no safer alternative given how far the conspiracy had already progressed. Forward was the only direction left available to her. Arrival in the capital brought her directly to the Izmailovsky Regiment, one of the key Guard units whose loyalty the Orlovs had spent months securing. Soldiers gathered around her, and she addressed them directly, framing her cause as a defense of Russia and orthodoxy against a ruler who had shown contempt for both. The soldiers responded with enthusiasm that exceeded even her expectations. Oaths of loyalty followed quickly, sworn openly and without hesitation. It was, in effect, the first formal declaration that her seizure of power had truly begun. From the Izmailovsky barracks, Catherine moved on to other regiments repeating variations of the same appeal wherever she went. The Semyonovsky Guard joined next, followed shortly by the Preobrazhensky Regiment, each pledging support with visible enthusiasm. News of her cause spread through the city rapidly, gathering momentum with each new regiment that declared for her. Crowds began forming in the streets, drawn by rumors of what was unfolding. What had begun as a carefully guarded conspiracy was becoming, within hours, an open and public uprising. The Orthodox Church added crucial legitimacy to the moment, with clergy quickly moving to support Catherine's cause once it became clear which direction events were heading. She was proclaimed Empress in a religious ceremony held with striking speed, given the circumstances. Church backing mattered enormously to a population for whom religious sanction carried real weight beyond mere political calculation. Peter's earlier disdain for Orthodox tradition now worked directly against him. Catherine, by contrast, had cultivated exactly this kind of religious credibility for years. Dressed in a guard's uniform borrowed for the occasion, Catherine rode at the head of a growing military procession toward Peterhof, where Peter remained largely unaware of how completely his authority had already collapsed. The image of the Empress in military dress, mounted and leading soldiers personally, struck observers as both startling and deeply effective. It signaled resolve rather than mere political maneuvering. Soldiers who witnessed her leading them directly found their loyalty reinforced further by the sight. She was not simply claiming power through others. She was visibly seizing it herself. Peter, meanwhile, remained oblivious for a critical stretch of time, occupied with his usual amusements at Oranienbaum, while events in the capital moved rapidly beyond his control. By the time reliable word reached him, Catherine's forces had already grown far too large and too committed for any realistic counteraction. His advisers urged various responses, ranging from flight to negotiation, none of which offered much genuine hope. Peter's own temperament, indecisive and easily overwhelmed, left him poorly equipped to respond effectively to a crisis of this magnitude. Panic, rather than strategy, defined his final hours as emperor. Attempts at resistance, where they existed at all, collapsed almost immediately once it became clear how thoroughly the Guard had abandoned him. Peter considered fleeing to Prussia, a plan that revealed how little he understood his own situation and how deeply his Prussian sympathies had damaged him among his own people. Advisors eventually convinced him that flight was impractical given the speed of Catherine's advance. Isolated and without meaningful military support, Peter's options narrowed rapidly to a single, humiliating choice. Abdication, however unwillingly, became the only path remaining. Peter signed the formal abdication on June 29th, ceding the throne without any real struggle beyond the emotional distress the moment clearly caused him. The document, drafted with careful attention to legal form, transferred power to Catherine cleanly and without ambiguity. Guards who had once served him now escorted him away as a prisoner rather than an emperor. The reign that had begun with such disastrous decisions 6 months earlier ended just as abruptly. Peter's fall had taken barely 6 months to complete entirely. He was taken to Ropsha, a modest estate outside the capital, held under guard while Catherine's supporters determined what to do with him next. Conditions there were reportedly tense, and Peter's own distress grew as the reality of his situation set in fully. Alexei Orlov, among others, oversaw his confinement personally. What exactly transpired at Rapsha over the following days remains debated among historians even now. The official explanation offered soon after would satisfy few who examined it closely. Peter died at Rapsha on July 6th, just over a week after signing his abdication, under circumstances the court described publicly as a sudden hemorrhoidal colic. Few outside the official announcement found this explanation convincing, given the timing and the obvious motive Catherine's supporters had for ensuring Peter posed no future threat. Alexei Orlov's own later letters hinted at a violent altercation, though the precise details remain unclear even today. Catherine's exact knowledge of or involvement in the circumstances of Peter's death has never been definitively established. What is certain is that his death removed, permanently, any possibility of a rival claim to the throne she had just seized. Catherine's public response to Peter's death followed the careful, composed pattern she had maintained throughout the entire crisis. She expressed appropriate grief publicly while ensuring the transition of power proceeded without disruption. Privately, whatever she felt about the circumstances, she moved forward with the practical business of securing her new position. Sentiment, however genuine or performed, could not be allowed to interfere with the urgent work of consolidating an empire she had just claimed by force. News of the coup spread quickly across Europe, generating a mixture of fascination and unease among foreign courts, unaccustomed to seeing a foreign-born princess seize a throne so decisively. Some rulers questioned the legitimacy of her claim, given the obvious violence surrounding Peter's death. Others recognized, more pragmatically, that Catherine's evident competence made her a ruler worth taking seriously, regardless of how she had come to power. Diplomatic relationships would need to adjust to this new reality quickly. Catherine, for her part, showed little concern for lingering questions about legitimacy once the throne was firmly in her hands. Within St. Petersburg itself, the transition proceeded with remarkable speed and surprisingly little disorder, given the dramatic nature of what had just occurred. The guard regiments that had supported her expected and received rewards for their loyalty. Officials who had hesitated during the crisis moved quickly to demonstrate support for the new Empress. Catherine understood that consolidating power required not just military backing, but broad institutional cooperation. She began that work almost immediately, even as the details surrounding Peter's death continued circulating quietly through court gossip. The coup itself had unfolded with startling speed, barely more than a single night and day separating quiet conspiracy from complete seizure of power. Catherine had spent 17 years absorbing humiliation, cultivating alliances, and studying the mechanics of Russian power with a patience few around her fully appreciated at the time. That patience had finally converted into decisive, almost theatrical action. A woman on horseback leading soldiers toward a throne that history had never intended for her. She had arrived in Russia a minor German princess, valued mainly for her bloodline. She now sat, however precariously, as its sole and absolute ruler. Chapter 7: Securing the Throne. Catherine's coronation took place in Moscow in September of 1762, staged with a deliberate grandeur meant to erase any lingering questions about how she had come to power. The Assumption Cathedral, ancient and heavy with the weight of centuries of Russian ritual, hosted the ceremony. Catherine placed the crown upon her own head, a gesture rich with symbolic independence, rather than reliance on any other authority to legitimize her rule. The event was calculated precisely, designed to project permanence rather than the chaos of the coup that had actually brought her there. Watching officials understood the message clearly. This was not a temporary arrangement. The crown itself, newly commissioned for the occasion, was designed to surpass anything worn by previous Russian rulers in both scale and craftsmanship. Thousands of diamonds and pearls covered its surface, arranged by jewelers instructed to spare no expense. Catherine understood the political value of spectacle as clearly as she understood the value of soldiers and alliances. A ruler who looked uncertain invited challenge. A ruler draped in unmistakable magnificence discouraged it before it could even form. Consolidating power required more than ceremony, however impressive, and Catherine turned quickly toward the practical work of securing loyalty across the institutions that actually governed Russia. She rewarded the Guard regiments generously for their role in the coup, distributing land, titles, and money to officers who had backed her. Grigory Orlov received particular attention, elevated to a position of considerable influence within her inner circle. These rewards served a dual purpose, expressing gratitude while also ensuring continued loyalty from the very forces capable of removing her just as quickly as they had installed her. Officials who had hesitated during the coup or who had served Peter without particular enthusiasm for Catherine's cause faced a more delicate calculation. Wholesale purges risked destabilizing the government at a moment when stability mattered enormously. Catherine chose instead a more measured approach, retaining experienced administrators while gradually replacing those whose loyalty seemed genuinely doubtful. This pragmatism reflected a broader pattern that would define her entire reign. Ideological purity mattered less to her than competence and reliable service. Beyond the immediate work of consolidation, Catherine turned her attention toward a far more ambitious project, one that revealed the intellectual convictions she had developed during years of private reading. She began drafting what would become known as the Nakaz, an extensive document intended to guide a comprehensive reform of Russian law. Montesquieu's influence appeared throughout its pages, alongside ideas drawn from other Enlightenment thinkers she had studied so carefully during her lonely years as a young Grand Duchess. The document argued for principles that were strikingly progressive by the standards of contemporary Russian governance. The Nakaz addressed questions of law, punishment, and the proper limits of state power with a sophistication that impressed European observers considerably. It argued against torture as a means of extracting confessions, a practice still common within the Russian legal system at the time. It suggested that punishment should aim at deterrence and reform rather than mere retribution. Such ideas, radical within the Russian context, positioned Catherine as a ruler genuinely engaged with the intellectual currents sweeping across Europe. Whether these ideals could survive contact with Russian political reality remained an open question. To advance these reforms, Catherine convened the Legislative Commission in 1767, an assembly bringing together representatives from across the empire's diverse regions and social classes. Nobles, merchants, free peasants, and various ethnic and religious communities sent delegates to participate in the process. This was itself a striking innovation, given how rarely such a broad cross section of Russian society had been consulted on matters of governance. Catherine intended the commission to help translate the Nakaz's principles into workable, lasting law. The Commission's deliberations, however, proved considerably more difficult to manage than Catherine had anticipated when she first conceived the project. Delegates arrived with competing interests that often had little relationship to the Enlightenment principles outlined in the Nakaz. Nobles sought to protect their privileges over serfs. Merchants pursued narrow economic advantages, and various regional representatives focused on parochial concerns rather than broader reform. Sessions grew lengthy and unproductive, consumed by disputes that resisted easy resolution. Catherine observed these proceedings with growing frustration, recognizing that the gap between Enlightenment theory and Russian social reality was proving far wider than her reading had prepared her to expect. Serfdom, in particular, presented an almost impossible obstacle to any coherent reform effort. Reducing the power nobles held over their serfs risked alienating the very class whose support had installed her on the throne in the first place. Catherine's own writings suggest she understood serfdom's injustice intellectually, yet she recognized the political impossibility of dismantling it, given her dependence on noble loyalty. The outbreak of war with the Ottoman Empire in 1768 provided Catherine with a convenient justification for suspending the Legislative Commission before it could produce any binding legal code. Officially, the commission was described as merely adjourned rather than dissolved, though it would never reconvene in any meaningful form. Some historians have read this as evidence that Catherine had grown disillusioned with the entire project once its practical limitations became clear. Others suggest external circumstances simply overtook an initiative that might otherwise have continued developing further. Despite its ultimate failure to produce a new legal code, the Commission achieved something valuable beyond its immediate legislative goals. It provided Catherine with an unusually detailed picture of conditions and grievances across her vast and diverse empire. Delegates had submitted extensive lists of local concerns, offering insight into regional administration, economic hardship, and social tension that would inform her governance for years afterward. The information gathered proved useful even without the sweeping legal reform originally intended. Catherine's early reign also involved careful attention to how she was perceived beyond Russia's borders, particularly among the European intellectuals whose respect she valued considerably. She understood that the circumstances of her rise to power, a coup followed swiftly by her husband's suspicious death, invited skepticism from foreign observers. Cultivating an image as an enlightened, philosophically engaged ruler offered a way to reshape that narrative. Correspondence with prominent European thinkers became an important tool in this broader effort at reputation management. Her approach to governance during these early years reflected a consistent pattern that would characterize her entire reign, a willingness to embrace progressive ideals rhetorically while pursuing pragmatic, often more conservative policies in practice. This apparent contradiction did not trouble Catherine particularly, since she viewed governance as fundamentally a practical exercise rather than an ideological one. Survival and stability mattered more to her than strict philosophical consistency. Enlightenment principles offered useful language and genuine inspiration, but they never overrode her core political instincts. Domestic administration occupied enormous amounts of her attention throughout these early years, as Catherine worked to strengthen the machinery of Russian government beyond what Elizabeth's reign had established. She reorganized provincial administration, worked to improve tax collection, and paid careful attention to how effectively her orders actually reached the empire's distant regions. Russia's sheer size posed constant administrative challenges that no amount of Enlightenment philosophy could fully resolve. Practical governance, Catherine understood, required attention to mundane details as much as grand principles. The nobility's position within Catherine's government remained central throughout this period, reflecting the political reality that had shaped her rise to power in the first place. She depended on noble support to maintain order across the empire's vast territories, and she structured many of her policies accordingly. This dependence limited how far she could push certain reforms, particularly those touching on serfdom or noble privilege. Catherine's intellectual sympathies and her political necessities existed, throughout her reign, in a state of ongoing and unresolved tension. By the end of the 1760s, Catherine had transformed from a ruler whose legitimacy rested primarily on guard loyalty into one whose authority extended across a functioning, increasingly organized government. The coronation's symbolism had been backed by years of careful institutional work, reward and consolidation, reform and retreat, all managed with the same pragmatic skill she had developed during her long years of observation before ever reaching the throne. The Legislative Commission's failure had not derailed her broader project of establishing legitimate, lasting rule. She had secured not just a crown, but the deeper foundations of an empire she intended to hold for a very long time. Chapter 8: Correspondence with Philosophers. Catherine's correspondence with Voltaire began in earnest during the 1760s, growing into one of the more consequential intellectual partnerships of the century. She initiated contact deliberately, aware that his approval carried enormous weight among European elites who otherwise viewed her rise to power with considerable suspicion. Voltaire, aging and increasingly isolated at his estate near the Swiss border, responded with evident delight at the attention of an empress who seemed genuinely engaged with his ideas. Their letters continued for years, covering philosophy, governance, and the ongoing business of Catherine's reign. Few relationships did more to reshape how Europe perceived her. Voltaire's letters praised Catherine extravagantly, sometimes to a degree that later readers have found difficult to separate from calculated flattery. He described her as embodying the enlightened rule that so many European monarchs claimed to admire but rarely practiced. Catherine, for her part, understood exactly what she was gaining from this exchange, and she cultivated it accordingly. Genuine intellectual respect mingled with clear political calculation throughout their correspondence. Both figures benefited considerably from the arrangement, and both understood the transaction underlying it. The substance of their letters ranged widely, touching on law, religious tolerance, and the proper role of a monarch in advancing reason over superstition. Catherine discussed her governing philosophy with a frankness she rarely allowed herself with anyone at her own court. Voltaire offered encouragement, occasional advice, and a steady stream of praise that Catherine seemed to genuinely value beyond its propaganda function. Their exchange read, at times, less like formal correspondence between a monarch and a philosopher than like a genuine friendship built entirely through letters. Neither ever met the other in person. Diderot's relationship with Catherine took a different, more direct form, culminating eventually in his actual journey to St. Petersburg. Catherine had long admired his work on the Encyclopédie, the vast compendium of Enlightenment knowledge that had faced censorship and financial difficulty in France. When Diderot found himself in need of money, having sold his personal library to secure his daughter's future, Catherine intervened generously. She purchased his library outright, arranged for him to retain possession of the books during his lifetime, and paid him a salary as its official librarian. It was an act of patronage as shrewd as it was generous. Diderot's gratitude for this arrangement eventually brought him to Russia in 1773, where he spent several months in direct conversation with the Empress herself. Their meetings occurred almost daily, often lasting hours, covering subjects ranging from law and education to the proper limits of monarchical power. Diderot spoke with a bluntness that startled many at court, unaccustomed to hearing anyone address Catherine so directly. Catherine, by most accounts, welcomed this candor rather than resenting it. She valued genuine intellectual engagement more than the empty flattery that surrounded her daily as Empress. Their conversations, however stimulating, also revealed genuine differences in how the two understood governance and reform. Diderot pressed Catherine toward more radical positions than she was willing to adopt in practice, particularly regarding the treatment of serfs and the redistribution of noble privilege. Catherine listened carefully, engaged seriously with his arguments, and ultimately rejected much of what he proposed as impractical given Russian political realities. She later remarked with characteristic pragmatism that Diderot wrote as though he were working with paper that could absorb anything, while she had to work with human skin considerably more sensitive to the pen. This tension between philosophical ideal and political reality ran throughout Catherine's engagement with Enlightenment thought more broadly, not merely in her exchanges with Diderot. She read voraciously, corresponded seriously, and genuinely absorbed many of the era's core arguments regarding reason, law, and human dignity. Yet she governed an empire built substantially on serfdom and noble privilege, institutions that sat uneasily alongside the philosophy she claimed to admire. Catherine seemed capable of holding both realities simultaneously, without the discomfort such a contradiction might have produced in a less pragmatic ruler. Beyond her correspondence with individual philosophers, Catherine used these relationships strategically to shape her broader reputation across Europe. She understood that the intellectuals shaping public opinion in Paris and beyond wielded influence disproportionate to their formal political power. Winning their approval meant winning a kind of legitimacy that military victories or dynastic claims alone could never fully provide. This calculation ran alongside, rather than against whatever genuine intellectual curiosity motivated her reading and writing. Catherine rarely separated sincere interest from strategic advantage when the two happened to align. Her patronage extended beyond mere correspondence into active collecting, particularly in the realm of art, where Catherine's ambitions matched the intellectual scope of her philosophical interests. She began acquiring paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects on a scale that quickly rivaled the great collections of Western Europe. Agents worked on her behalf across the continent, purchasing entire collections when opportunities arose. This accumulation was never simply personal indulgence. It represented, like her correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot, a deliberate effort to position Russia as a genuine cultural rival to France and the other great powers of Europe. The foundation of what would become the Hermitage collection traces directly to these early acquisitions, beginning with a substantial purchase of paintings originally assembled for the Prussian king, who could no longer afford them. Catherine acquired the collection eagerly, adding it to a growing assembly of art housed within her palace. What began as private acquisition gradually took on the character of a national treasure, though it would remain closed to the general public for generations after Catherine's death. The scale of her ambition here matched the scale of her ambition everywhere else in her reign. Catherine's engagement with Enlightenment philosophy also shaped how she approached education and the cultivation of Russian intellectual life more broadly. She supported the expansion of schools, encouraged the growth of a Russian literary culture, and corresponded with figures beyond Voltaire and Diderot who shared similar concerns about reason and reform. This was not a uniform or fully coherent program. It reflected, instead, the same pragmatic, opportunistic approach to Enlightenment ideals that characterized her legal reforms and her patronage of the arts. Critics, both during her reign and afterward, have pointed to the gap between Catherine's professed philosophical ideals and the realities of her governance as evidence of hypocrisy or calculated performance. Serfdom expanded rather than contracted during her reign, and noble privilege remained largely intact despite her intellectual engagement with arguments against arbitrary power. Defenders have countered that Catherine operated within political constraints that made radical reform genuinely impossible, whatever her personal convictions might have been. The debate over how sincerely to read her philosophical commitments has never fully resolved itself. What remains clear, regardless of how one interprets her sincerity, is that Catherine's intellectual engagement was neither shallow nor purely performative in its execution. Her letters reveal a mind genuinely wrestling with the ideas she encountered, capable of nuanced argument and honest disagreement, even with figures as formidable as Diderot. She read widely and thought carefully about questions of law, governance, and human nature throughout her entire reign. Whatever gap existed between her philosophy and her practice, it was not for lack of genuine engagement with the ideas themselves. Voltaire's death in 1778 marked a significant loss for Catherine, ending a correspondence that had spanned roughly 15 years and shaped much of how Europe understood her reign. She mourned his passing in terms that suggested real personal feeling beyond mere political calculation. She later acquired his personal library as well, adding it to her growing collection and ensuring that his intellectual legacy remained connected to her own court. The gesture echoed her earlier purchase of Diderot's library, another instance of patronage transforming into permanent cultural acquisition. By the time these relationships had run their course, Catherine had successfully reshaped her image from a foreign usurper who had seized power through violence into one of Europe's most celebrated patrons of Enlightenment thought. This transformation mattered enormously for how her reign would be remembered, both by contemporaries and by later historians. It also reflected something genuine about Catherine herself, a woman whose intellectual curiosity first kindled during lonely years of private reading as a neglected Grand Duchess, never fully receded once she gained the power to indulge it fully. The girl who had once turned to Montesquieu and Tacitus for company had become an empress corresponding as an equal with the greatest minds of her age. Chapter 9: War with the Ottomans. Tension between Russia and the Ottoman Empire had been building for years before open conflict finally erupted in 1768. Driven by competing ambitions across the Black Sea region and the borderlands of Poland. Catherine's growing influence over Polish affairs alarmed Ottoman officials, who viewed Russian expansion with understandable suspicion. A border incident involving Russian troops pursuing rebels into Ottoman territory provided the immediate spark. The Ottoman Sultan declared war shortly afterward. Catherine, only 6 years into her reign, now faced the first major military test of her rule. The war presented Catherine with both danger and opportunity in roughly equal measure, given Russia's long-standing ambitions toward the Black Sea and the strategic advantages that access might eventually provide. Control over warm water ports had eluded Russian rulers for generations, hampered by geography and the persistent power of Ottoman forces along the coast. Catherine understood that a decisive victory could reshape Russia's position among the European powers considerably. Failure, conversely, risked undermining the legitimacy she had worked so hard to establish since the coup. The stakes extended well beyond simple territorial gain. Catherine relied heavily on capable military commanders to prosecute the war, recognizing that her own strengths lay in administration and diplomacy rather than battlefield command. Pyotr Rumyantsev emerged as one of her most effective generals, achieving notable victories against Ottoman forces in the war's early years. His campaigns demonstrated the growing sophistication of Russian military organization under Catherine's administration. She trusted her commanders with considerable autonomy, intervening from St. Petersburg mainly through strategic direction rather than detailed tactical oversight. This approach reflected her broader governing style, delegating competently while maintaining ultimate control. Among the more dramatic episodes of the war unfolded not on land but at sea, where Catherine's ambitions extended further than many observers might have expected from a landlocked power like Russia. She dispatched a fleet from the Baltic on an extraordinary journey around Western Europe, through the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean, aimed at striking Ottoman naval power directly in its home waters. The scale of this undertaking impressed and unsettled European observers in equal measure. Few had anticipated Russian naval ambition reaching quite this far from its traditional waters. Alexei Orlov, brother to Grigory and one of Catherine's most trusted allies since the coup that had installed her, commanded this Mediterranean expedition despite having limited prior naval experience. His appointment reflected Catherine's tendency to reward loyalty with significant responsibility, a pattern established clearly during the earliest days of her reign. British naval officers, hired to supplement Russian expertise, provided crucial technical guidance throughout the campaign. The combination proved more effective than skeptics had initially predicted. The decisive naval confrontation came at Chesma Bay in July of 1770, where the Russian fleet encountered a considerably larger Ottoman force anchored along the Anatolian coast. Initial engagement pushed the Ottoman ships into the confined waters of the bay itself, a tactical development that would prove catastrophic for the larger fleet. Russian forces followed with fire ships, vessels deliberately set ablaze and directed into the packed Ottoman formation. The resulting destruction was nearly total. Almost the entire Ottoman fleet burned or sank within the confines of that single crowded bay. News of the victory at Chesma reached St. Petersburg to considerable celebration, marking one of the most significant naval triumphs in Russian history to that point. Catherine understood immediately the propaganda value of such a decisive victory, commissioning commemorative medals, paintings, and monuments to ensure the triumph would be remembered appropriately. The battle demonstrated Russian military capability extending far beyond its traditional continental boundaries. European powers took notice, recalibrating their assessment of Russian strength under Catherine's leadership. On land, meanwhile, Rumyantsev continued achieving significant victories against Ottoman forces across the Danube region, steadily wearing down Ottoman capacity to continue effective resistance. His campaigns combined careful strategic planning with aggressive tactical execution, qualities that made him one of the era's most respected European commanders. Territory changed hands repeatedly as Russian forces pushed further into traditionally Ottoman-controlled lands. The cumulative effect of these victories, both naval and land-based, placed the Ottoman Empire in an increasingly difficult negotiating position as the war dragged onward. Diplomatic negotiations accompanied military operations throughout the conflict, reflecting Catherine's consistent preference for combining force with careful diplomatic maneuvering wherever possible. She understood that lasting gains required more than battlefield success. They required agreements that other European powers would accept and respect going forward. Negotiations proved complicated, extending over years as both sides maneuvered for advantageous terms while continuing military operations in parallel. The war finally concluded with the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarka in 1774, an agreement that transformed Russia's strategic position considerably and confirmed Catherine's standing as a formidable European ruler. Russia gained significant territory along the Black Sea coast, along with rights of navigation that had eluded previous rulers for generations. The treaty also granted Russia a vaguely defined right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman territory, a provision that would generate considerable diplomatic friction in the decades that followed. Crimea, meanwhile, gained nominal independence from Ottoman control, though Russian influence over the territory increased substantially as a direct result. This treaty represented one of the most significant territorial and strategic achievements of Catherine's entire reign, reshaping the balance of power along Russia's southern frontier. Access to the Black Sea, long sought by previous Russian rulers, had finally been secured through a combination of military skill and patient diplomacy. Catherine's reputation, both domestically and across Europe, rose considerably as a result of this outcome. She had proven capable not merely of seizing power through a palace coup, but of successfully prosecuting a prolonged war against a formidable imperial rival. The war's conduct and outcome also revealed important patterns that would recur throughout the remainder of Catherine's reign, particularly her skill at identifying and empowering capable subordinates while maintaining overall strategic direction herself. Rumiantsev's battlefield successes and Orlov's naval triumph both reflected choices Catherine had made regarding leadership and trust. She rewarded these successes generously, reinforcing the loyalty that had proven so essential during her rise to power. Competence, consistently, earned advancement within her administration far more reliably than birth or connection alone. Financial costs of the war, however, weighed heavily on the Russian treasury, requiring careful management even amid the celebrations surrounding military success. Sustained campaigns across vast distances demanded enormous resources, straining an economy still developing the administrative sophistication needed to support prolonged conflict efficiently. Catherine paid close attention to these fiscal pressures, aware that military triumph meant little if it bankrupted the very state she had worked to strengthen. Balancing ambition against practical fiscal constraints remained a persistent challenge throughout her reign. The war also complicated Russia's relationships with other European powers, particularly Austria and Prussia, both of which watched Russian expansion into Ottoman territory with considerable unease. Concerns about shifting the European balance of power too dramatically in Russia's favor prompted diplomatic maneuvering among these rivals throughout the conflict's later stages. Catherine navigated these tensions carefully, understanding that overreach could unite her rivals against her. This diplomatic caution would soon manifest in a very different arena as competing ambitions toward Poland began converging among the same three powers. By the time peace was finally secured in 1774, Catherine had transformed Russia's strategic position along its southern border more thoroughly than any ruler in generations. She had proven herself capable of managing prolonged warfare, skilled diplomacy, and the complex coordination required to sustain campaigns across vast and difficult terrain. The victory at Chesma alone had demonstrated Russian naval ambition, reaching farther than Europe had previously credited. Catherine, once dismissed by skeptics as an unlikely foreign usurper, had secured her reputation as one of the era's most capable and consequential rulers. Chapter 10: The Pugachev Rebellion. Even as the war against the Ottomans drew toward its conclusion, a very different kind of threat was gathering strength within Russia's own borders, one that would test Catherine's rule more severely than any foreign conflict had managed. Along the Volga and Ural regions, discontent among Cossacks, serfs, and various minority populations had been simmering for years, fueled by economic hardship and resentment toward centralized authority. A charismatic figure emerged from within this discontent, claiming an identity that struck directly at the legitimacy of Catherine's own throne. His name was Yemlian Pugachev, and his claim was audacious even by the standards of impostor rebellions common throughout Russian history. Pugachev declared himself to be Peter III, insisting that Catherine's husband had never actually died at Ropsha and had instead escaped to lead a rightful uprising against the woman who had stolen his throne. This claim, however implausible to educated observers, resonated powerfully among populations who had heard only rumors and official announcements regarding Peter's death. Pugachev possessed genuine charisma and a talent for rallying disparate groups around his cause. Cossacks, disaffected by restrictions on their traditional autonomy, formed his earliest and most reliable base of support. The rebellion spread with startling speed once it gained momentum, drawing in populations well beyond its initial Cossack core. Serfs, suffering under the very institution Catherine had privately questioned yet politically preserved, saw in Pugachev's uprising a chance to overturn an oppressive system entirely. Factory workers, particularly those laboring under brutal conditions in the Ural mining industry, joined the cause in significant numbers as well. Various non-Russian ethnic groups, long resentful of imperial expansion into their territories, added further fuel to an already widening conflict. What had begun as a regional Cossack grievance was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. Pugachev's forces achieved early successes that alarmed officials in St. Petersburg considerably, capturing towns and fortresses across a broad stretch of territory along the Volga and into the Ural region. His army, though poorly organized by conventional military standards, benefited enormously from the genuine desperation and anger driving its recruits. Local garrisons, often undermanned and poorly prepared, struggled to mount effective resistance against the rebellion's initial momentum. Catherine, still managing the final stages of the Ottoman War, found herself confronting a second major crisis simultaneously. Violence accompanying the rebellion's advance proved severe, with rebel forces targeting nobles, officials, and anyone associated with the imperial administration they blamed for their suffering. Massacres occurred in towns that fell under Pugachev's control, reflecting the accumulated rage of populations who had endured genuine hardship under the existing system. Reports of this violence reached St. Petersburg with increasing frequency, painting a picture of a rebellion far more dangerous than the isolated uprisings Russia had weathered in previous decades. Catherine understood that decisive action had become unavoidable. The scale of the threat forced Catherine to redirect substantial military resources towards suppressing the rebellion, resources that might otherwise have remained focused on consolidating her recent gains against the Ottomans. She dispatched experienced commanders and significant troop numbers toward the affected regions, recognizing that half measures would only prolong a crisis threatening the stability of her entire reign. General Alexander Bibikov received initial command of the suppression campaign, tasked with restoring order across a vast and difficult territory. Bibikov's early efforts achieved some success, though his death from illness partway through the campaign complicated Russian efforts to maintain consistent pressure against the rebellion. Command eventually passed to other generals as the campaign continued, reflecting the difficulty of coordinating operations across such enormous distances. Pugachev's forces, despite mounting Russian pressure, continued winning victories and expanding their territorial reach for a considerable stretch of the conflict. The rebellion's persistence troubled Catherine deeply, given how directly it challenged both her authority and the broader stability of the social order she governed. Alexander Suvorov, a commander who would later become one of Russia's most celebrated military figures, eventually joined the effort to crush the rebellion decisively. His arrival marked a turning point in the campaign, bringing renewed energy and tactical sophistication to an effort that had struggled against Pugachev's persistent momentum. Russian forces gradually regained the initiative, pushing rebel forces back across the territories they had previously seized. The tide, after considerable difficulty, had finally begun turning in the government's favor. Pugachev's fortunes collapsed rapidly once Russian military pressure achieved sustained effectiveness, his forces suffering defeat after defeat as the campaign progressed through 1774. Support among his followers began fracturing as military setbacks mounted, and the promise of victory grew increasingly distant. Eventually, some of his own Cossack associates betrayed him, handing him over to Russian authorities in hopes of securing leniency for themselves. The rebellion that had once threatened the stability of Catherine's entire reign ended not in battlefield triumph, but in the quiet betrayal of its own leader. Pugachev was transported to Moscow in a cage, displayed publicly as authorities worked to demonstrate the complete and total defeat of his rebellion. His trial proceeded quickly, with the outcome never genuinely in doubt given the scale of violence and disruption attributed to his uprising. He was executed in early 1775, his death staged publicly to reinforce the message that rebellion against imperial authority would meet severe and certain punishment. Catherine, informed of these proceedings from St. Petersburg, approved the harsh treatment as necessary to restore confidence in her government's strength. The rebellion's suppression involved punishment extending well beyond Pugachev himself, with authorities pursuing harsh reprisals against communities and individuals who had supported the uprising. Villages that had backed Pugachev faced severe consequences, and suspected sympathizers were pursued with considerable determination across the affected regions. Catherine's government made little effort toward reconciliation, prioritizing instead the restoration of order through demonstrated force. This approach reflected a hardening in Catherine's own political outlook, a shift away from the more idealistic reformist instincts that had characterized her earlier engagement with Enlightenment philosophy. The Pugachev rebellion left a lasting mark on Catherine's approach to governance, particularly regarding questions of reform and the treatment of serfs that had once interested her considerably during her correspondence with philosophers like Diderot. The uprising had demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, the danger inherent in a social system built on such deep and widespread grievance. Rather than pursuing reforms to address these underlying tensions, however, Catherine drew the opposite lesson from the crisis. Order and control, she concluded, mattered more than the risks associated with genuine structural change. This hardened outlook manifested in administrative reforms aimed primarily at strengthening centralized control over Russia's vast and often unruly territories, rather than at addressing the economic and social grievances that had fueled the rebellion in the first place. Catherine reorganized provincial administration considerably in the years following the uprising, seeking to ensure that future unrest could be identified and suppressed more quickly than Pugachev's rebellion had initially been. These reforms reflected pragmatic lessons learned through genuine crisis rather than any renewed commitment to the Enlightenment ideals she had once discussed so openly with her philosopher correspondence. The rebellion also affected how Catherine related to the nobility going forward, reinforcing rather than weakening her dependence on their loyalty and support. Nobles, having witnessed the violence directed against their own class during the uprising, drew closer to a government capable of protecting their interests against similar future threats. Catherine, recognizing this dynamic, further entrenched noble privilege in the years following the rebellion, rather than working to reduce it. Whatever intellectual sympathy she had once held for reducing the burdens placed on serfs receded considerably in the aftermath of witnessing exactly what unleashed peasant anger could produce. By the time the rebellion's suppression was fully complete, Catherine had weathered the most severe internal threat of her entire reign, emerging from the crisis with her authority intact, but her governing philosophy noticeably altered. The idealistic reformer who had once drafted the Nakaz and hosted Diderot for months of philosophical conversation had given way to a ruler increasingly focused on order, control, and the preservation of the social hierarchy that had installed and sustained her rule. Pugachev's rebellion, crushed decisively and punished severely, marked a genuine turning point. Catherine's empire had survived its gravest internal challenge, but the Empress who emerged from that ordeal was measurably harder than the one who had entered it. Chapter 11: The First Partition of Poland. While Russian forces were still engaged against the Ottomans and Pugachev's rebellion had not yet erupted, a separate and equally consequential ambition was taking shape regarding Russia's western neighbor. Poland, weakened by decades of internal political dysfunction, presented an opportunity that Catherine and her fellow European monarchs found increasingly difficult to ignore. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had long suffered from a political system that made effective governance nearly impossible, hampered by a legislative structure allowing any single delegate to block collective action entirely. Catherine had exercised considerable influence over Polish affairs for years already, favoring a former lover, Stanislaw Poniatowski, whom she had helped install as king. Poniatowski's rule, however, satisfied neither Polish nationalists seeking genuine reform nor the neighboring powers who preferred a weak and pliable Poland to a strong and independent one. Internal Polish factions frequently appealed to foreign powers for support, drawing Russia, Prussia, and Austria progressively deeper into Polish domestic politics. Religious tensions further complicated the situation, as disputes over the rights of non-Catholic minorities within Poland provided additional pretext for foreign intervention. Catherine used these religious disputes strategically, positioning Russia as protector of Orthodox and Protestant populations facing discrimination under Polish Catholic rule. Frederick the Great of Prussia, watching Russian influence over Poland expand considerably during these years, grew increasingly concerned about the shifting balance of power along his own eastern border. Rather than opposing Russian ambitions directly, Frederick proposed an alternative solution that would satisfy multiple powers simultaneously. He suggested that Russia, Prussia, and Austria each annex portions of Polish territory, resolving competing ambitions through coordinated division rather than through conflict among themselves. This proposal offered Catherine a way to formalize gains she had already been pursuing informally, while also addressing Frederick's own territorial ambitions along the Prussian border. Austria's position proved more complicated, given Empress Maria Theresa's genuine moral reservations about participating in what amounted to the outright dismemberment of a neighboring sovereign state. Her son Joseph II held considerably fewer scruples about the arrangement, viewing it primarily through the lens of strategic advantage rather than moral principle. Maria Theresa eventually accepted Austrian participation, reportedly with considerable private anguish, once it became clear that Russia and Prussia intended to proceed regardless of Austrian objections. Better, she concluded, to share in the gains than to watch her rivals grow stronger while Austria abstained entirely. Negotiations among the three powers proceeded with remarkable efficiency once the basic framework had been agreed upon, reflecting how thoroughly each government recognized the mutual benefits involved. Catherine's diplomats worked carefully to ensure Russia's portion aligned with strategic priorities she had developed over years of engagement with Polish affairs. Prussian and Austrian representatives pursued their own territorial interests with similar determination. The absence of any serious external check on their combined power made the entire arrangement considerably easier to finalize than such a dramatic redrawing of borders might otherwise have required. The formal agreement was signed in 1772, dividing substantial portions of Polish territory among the three participating powers without any meaningful consultation of the Polish population whose fate was being decided. Russia's share included territory in the eastern regions of the Commonwealth, extending Russian borders considerably westward and incorporating populations that Catherine had long claimed a religious obligation to protect. Prussia gained territory connecting its scattered holdings more coherently, a long-standing strategic priority for Frederick. Austria annexed a substantial southern region rich in resources and population. Polish resistance to this dismemberment existed, though it proved largely ineffective against the combined military and diplomatic power of three major European states acting in concert. The Polish government, weakened by the very institutional dysfunction that had made the partition possible in the first place, lacked the capacity to mount any serious challenge. Some Polish nobles attempted diplomatic appeals to other European powers, hoping to generate broader opposition to the partition. These appeals generated sympathy in some quarters, but little actual intervention, since no other power possessed sufficient interest or capability to challenge Russia, Prussia, and Austria simultaneously. Catherine justified the partition publicly through a combination of historical claims and protective rhetoric regarding persecuted religious minorities within the annexed territories. Privately, the calculation was considerably more straightforward, reflecting simple territorial ambition dressed in the language of legitimate grievance. This pattern, justifying expansion through protective or historical rhetoric while pursuing straightforwardly strategic goals, would recur throughout the remainder of Catherine's reign. She had learned, across years of governance, exactly how to frame naked ambition in terms that satisfied both domestic audiences and foreign observers inclined toward skepticism. The partition's consequences extended well beyond the immediate territorial changes, reshaping the political dynamics of the entire region for decades afterward. Poland, having lost roughly a third of its territory and population in a single stroke, faced mounting internal pressure toward reform, motivated partly by the shock of witnessing such dramatic external dismemberment. These reform efforts, when they eventually emerged more forcefully decades later, would ultimately prove insufficient to prevent further partitions in the years ahead. The 1772 division established a precedent that Russia, Prussia, and Austria would return to when convenient, treating Polish sovereignty as fundamentally negotiable whenever their combined interests aligned. European reaction to the partition proved relatively muted, reflecting both the absence of any power capable of effectively opposing the three participants and a broader 18th century acceptance of territorial adjustment among major states as an ordinary feature of international politics. France, traditionally sympathetic to Polish independence, lacked the military and diplomatic capacity to intervene meaningfully given its own domestic and colonial preoccupations during this period. Britain showed similarly limited interest in a conflict occurring far from its immediate strategic concerns. This absence of meaningful external opposition confirmed, for Catherine, how effectively coordinated action among major powers could reshape territorial boundaries with minimal consequence. For Catherine personally, the partition represented a significant expansion of Russian territory achieved through diplomatic coordination rather than costly warfare, a considerably more efficient method of expansion than the prolonged conflict she had simultaneously been managing against the Ottoman Empire. The territories gained brought valuable population, resources, and strategic depth along Russia's western frontier. This success reinforced Catherine's growing confidence in her ability to reshape the map of Eastern Europe according to Russian strategic interests, a confidence that would inform her approach to Poland again in the years ahead. The newly incorporated populations presented Catherine with fresh administrative challenges, requiring careful management of communities whose language, religion, and political traditions differed considerably from those in Russia's existing territories. She approached this integration pragmatically, generally allowing considerable local autonomy in exchange for basic political loyalty and tax compliance. This approach reflected the same practical governing philosophy she had applied throughout her reign, prioritizing stability and functional control over rigid uniformity across her expanding and increasingly diverse empire. Poniatowski, still nominally king of a diminished Poland, found his position considerably weakened by the partition, dependent more than ever on Russian goodwill to maintain even the reduced authority he retained. Catherine's influence over Polish affairs, already substantial before 1772, deepened further as a direct consequence of the territorial settlement. She continued treating Poland less as an independent neighboring state than as a client territory whose domestic politics remained subject to Russian oversight whenever Russian interests required intervention. This relationship would define Polish-Russian dynamics for the remainder of Catherine's reign. The partition also demonstrated something important about how Catherine balanced her genuine intellectual engagement with Enlightenment principles against the harder realities of territorial ambition and strategic calculation. She had corresponded extensively with philosophers who championed ideas of national sovereignty and self-determination, yet she participated eagerly in the dismemberment of a sovereign neighboring state when the opportunity arose. This apparent contradiction troubled her contemporaries considerably less than it might trouble later observers, reflecting an era in which such principles applied selectively, if at all, to the conduct of major powers toward weaker neighbors. By the time the partition's implementation had been fully completed, Catherine had achieved a substantial expansion of Russian territory through calculated diplomacy rather than prolonged military conflict, adding considerably to the gains she had already secured through her ongoing war against the Ottoman Empire. The empire she now governed extended further westward than it had at any point in Russian history, incorporating new populations and new administrative challenges alongside the territorial prestige such expansion provided. Poland's diminishment marked only the first stage of a longer process that would eventually eliminate the Commonwealth entirely, though Catherine could not yet know how completely that process would eventually unfold. What she understood clearly, even in this early success, was how effectively cooperation among major powers could reshape the map of Europe when their interests happened to align. Chapter 12: Potemkin. Grigory Potemkin first entered Catherine's orbit during the June coup of 1762, a minor cavalry officer whose contribution that night was small enough to go largely unnoticed at the time. He had reportedly offered Catherine a sword knot during the chaotic hours of the uprising, a gesture of loyalty that meant little immediately, but would eventually take on considerable retrospective significance. For years afterward, Potemkin remained on the periphery of court life, serving competently, but without the prominence enjoyed by figures like Grigory Orlov. His moment had not yet arrived. That moment came gradually through the early 1770s, as Potemkin distinguished himself during the war against the Ottoman Empire, demonstrating both military competence and a personal magnetism that increasingly caught Catherine's attention. He corresponded with her directly during the campaign, his letters revealing wit and intelligence that set him apart from many of the officers surrounding her. Catherine, whose relationship with Grigory Orlov had grown strained after years together, found herself drawn to Potemkin's combination of intellect, ambition, and physical presence. Their relationship, once it developed fully, would become the most significant partnership of Catherine's entire reign. Potemkin arrived at court permanently in 1774, just as the Ottoman War concluded and the Pugachev rebellion reached its final violent resolution. His rise thereafter proved remarkably swift, elevated quickly to positions of significant authority and trust within Catherine's government. Contemporaries noted the intensity of the relationship immediately, recognizing that Potemkin occupied a place in Catherine's life unlike any of her previous companions. He possessed something the others had lacked: genuine intellectual partnership alongside personal devotion. Their romantic relationship deepened considerably during this period, and evidence suggests the two may have married secretly sometime in 1774, though no definitive documentation of the ceremony survives to confirm it beyond dispute. Historians have debated the marriage's existence for generations, examining letters between the two that hint strongly at a bond beyond ordinary courtship. Catherine's correspondence with Potemkin during these years reveals an intimacy and emotional dependency unlike anything documented in her other relationships. Whatever the precise legal status of their union, its emotional reality was unmistakable to those who observed them together. What distinguished Potemkin from Catherine's previous favorites was not merely the depth of personal connection, but the scope of genuine political partnership that developed between them. Unlike Orlov, whose influence had remained largely tied to his military role, Potemkin became an indispensable administrator, advisor, and collaborator across nearly every major initiative of Catherine's later reign. She trusted his judgment on matters ranging from military strategy to territorial administration to foreign policy. Their relationship evolved over time from romantic passion into something closer to genuine co-governance. However unofficial, that arrangement remained in formal terms. Potemkin's responsibilities expanded dramatically once Catherine appointed him Governor General of Russia's newly acquired southern territories, a vast and largely undeveloped region she called New Russia. This appointment reflected enormous trust, granting Potemkin authority over territory recently wrested from Ottoman influence and still requiring substantial development before it could function as a productive part of the empire. He approached the assignment with characteristic energy, founding new cities, encouraging settlement, and working to transform sparsely populated steppe into a genuinely integrated Russian province. Among Potemkin's most significant achievements during this period was his administration's role in the eventual annexation of Crimea, a territory that had gained nominal independence from Ottoman control following the treaty ending the earlier war. Continued instability within Crimea, combined with persistent Ottoman influence over the peninsula's internal politics, convinced Catherine that outright annexation offered greater security than continued reliance on a fragile and contested independence. Potemkin managed the diplomatic and military groundwork for this annexation with considerable skill, ensuring the process proceeded with minimal resistance from either Crimean Tatars or the wider international community. Crimea's formal annexation occurred in 1783, achieved largely through Potemkin's careful preparation rather than through the kind of prolonged military conflict that had characterized earlier Russian expansion into the region. The peninsula's strategic value proved immense, providing Russia with warm water ports and naval bases along the Black Sea that had eluded previous rulers for generations. Catherine celebrated the annexation as validation of the broader southern strategy she and Potemkin had pursued together since the conclusion of the Ottoman War. It represented, in many respects, the fulfillment of ambitions Russian rulers had held for well over a century. Potemkin's administration of New Russia extended well beyond military and diplomatic achievement, encompassing ambitious infrastructure and settlement projects designed to transform the region's economic potential. He founded several cities that would grow into significant urban centers, including Kherson and later Sevastopol, strategically positioned to support Russian naval and commercial interests along the Black Sea coast. Settlement programs encouraged migration into the newly acquired territories, drawing colonists from various parts of the empire and beyond. These efforts reflected Potemkin's genuine talent for large-scale administrative and developmental projects, distinguishing him from officials whose ambitions remained more narrowly military or political. This period also gave rise to one of the more persistent legends associated with Potemkin's legacy, the claim that he constructed elaborate fake villages, mere painted facades, to deceive Catherine during her famous tour of the Southern Territories in 1787. Historians have generally concluded that this story, while capturing something of Potemkin's genuine talent for theatrical presentation, considerably exaggerates and distorts the reality of what actually occurred. Real development had indeed taken place across the region, even if Potemkin certainly took care to present it in its most favorable light during Catherine's visit. The phrase Potemkin village, regardless of its questionable historical accuracy, entered common usage as shorthand for elaborate deception designed to disguise underlying reality. Catherine's tour of the Southern Territories in 1787 represented a significant public demonstration of the achievements Potemkin's administration had produced across the region, drawing foreign dignitaries and ambassadors to witness firsthand the transformation of what had recently been contested borderland. The journey proceeded with considerable pageantry, showcasing new cities, developing infrastructure, and the strategic ports that now anchored Russian power along the Black Sea coast. Whatever exaggerations accompanied the presentation, the underlying transformation of the region was genuine and substantial. Foreign observers, whatever their skepticism regarding certain theatrical elements, came away impressed by the scale of what Russia had accomplished in such a relatively short span of years. As their romantic relationship gradually cooled over time, evolving into something closer to enduring partnership and deep friendship, Potemkin's political influence remained undiminished, and in some respects continued growing even as personal intimacy receded. Catherine relied on him for counsel across an extraordinarily broad range of matters, treating him as her most trusted advisor even after their relationship had shifted away from its earlier romantic character. Few figures in her reign commanded this level of sustained trust and influence across such an extended period. Potemkin's personality, by most contemporary accounts, combined genuine brilliance with considerable eccentricity, prone to mood swings, extravagant displays, and periods of intense withdrawal alternating with bursts of remarkable productivity. Catherine navigated these fluctuations with evident patience, valuing his contributions enough to accommodate a temperament that might have exhausted a less committed partner. Their correspondence throughout the years reveals genuine affection persisting well beyond the romantic phase of their relationship, suggesting a bond considerably deeper than mere political convenience. Military affairs remained central to Potemkin's ongoing responsibilities, even as his administrative duties expanded considerably, and he continued playing a significant role in Russia's later military campaigns against the Ottoman Empire during the 1780s and into the early 1790s. His organizational reforms strengthened Russian military capability considerably, building on lessons learned during the earlier conflict that had first brought him to prominence. Catherine relied on his judgment regarding military strategy as thoroughly as she relied on him for administrative and diplomatic matters, a testament to the extraordinary breadth of trust she had invested in him over nearly 2 decades of partnership. By the time Potemkin's career reached its later stages, he had become arguably the single most influential figure in Catherine's government, beyond the Empress herself, shaping Russian expansion, administration, and military strategy across the southern territories more decisively than any other individual of the era. His death in 1791, occurring while he traveled through the very southern territories he had spent years developing, devastated Catherine profoundly. She reportedly collapsed upon receiving the news, and her subsequent correspondence revealed grief far exceeding what mere political loss might explain. The partnership that had begun with a sword knot offered amid the chaos of a coup had become, over nearly 2 decades, the central relationship of her entire reign, and its ending marked a loss from which Catherine, by most accounts, never fully recovered. Chapter 13: Empire at its Height. By the late 1780s, Catherine's Russia had reached a level of territorial expansion and international influence that would have seemed unimaginable to the isolated young Grand Duchess who had once endured years of marital silence and neglect. Her southern conquests had secured warm water ports and strategic depth along the Black Sea. Her western ambitions, meanwhile, remained far from complete, with Poland still presenting opportunities for further Russian influence and eventual territorial gain. The empire she governed now stretched across an enormous expanse of Europe and Asia, administered through a system she had spent decades refining and strengthening. Poland's internal politics had continued deteriorating through the 1780s, weakened further by the very institutional dysfunction that had made the first partition possible over a decade earlier. Reform-minded Polish nationalists, alarmed by their country's diminished status following 1772, pushed for constitutional changes intended to strengthen central authority and reduce the paralyzing influence of the liberum veto. These reform efforts culminated in the Constitution of May 3, 1791, a document that alarmed neighboring powers considerably by suggesting Poland might actually recover genuine independent strength. Catherine viewed this development with particular concern, given how directly it threatened Russian influence over Polish affairs. Russian intervention followed quickly once the new constitution had been adopted, justified through familiar rhetoric regarding the protection of traditional Polish liberties, supposedly threatened by the reformers' centralizing ambitions. Russian troops entered Poland in 1792, ostensibly supporting a coalition of conservative Polish nobles who opposed the constitutional reforms. This intervention proceeded with considerable military success, given the disparity between Russian military strength and the limited forces Poland could muster in response. Catherine's justification, however transparent to contemporary observers, provided sufficient diplomatic cover for what amounted to a straightforward reassertion of Russian dominance. The Second Partition followed in 1793, dividing additional Polish territory between Russia and Prussia, with Austria notably excluded from this particular round of annexation due to its preoccupation with events unfolding in revolutionary France. Russia's share proved substantial, extending Russian control deep into territories that had remained nominally independent since the First Partition 2 decades earlier. Prussia gained additional territory as well, further strengthening its own position at Poland's expense. What remained of independent Poland after this second division was a greatly diminished state, barely capable of maintaining even nominal sovereignty going forward. Polish resistance to this second dismemberment proved more determined than it had been in 1772, reflecting both the shock of renewed foreign aggression and the reformist energy that had briefly flourished under the new constitution. Tadeusz Kościuszko, a military leader who had earlier gained experience fighting in the American Revolutionary War, emerged as the central figure organizing Polish resistance against the partitioning powers. His uprising, beginning in 1794, achieved some early success, rallying considerable popular support across Polish territories, still nominally under Polish control. Kościuszko's rebellion, despite its initial momentum, ultimately proved insufficient against the combined military strength of Russia and Prussia, both determined to crush any effective Polish resistance before it could threaten their existing territorial gains. Russian forces under General Suvorov, whose reputation had already been established through earlier campaigns, played a decisive role in suppressing the uprising through 1794. The rebellion's defeat sealed Poland's fate entirely, eliminating any remaining possibility that the Commonwealth might recover genuine independent strength. The Third Partition followed in 1795, this time eliminating Poland as an independent state entirely, divided completely among Russia, Prussia, and Austria, without any remaining Polish government to even nominally govern. Catherine's share of this final division extended Russian territory further westward than any previous acquisition, incorporating substantial additional population and land into an empire already vast beyond the imagination of previous Russian rulers. Stanislav Poniatowski, the King Catherine had installed decades earlier, abdicated as part of the settlement, ending a monarchy that had existed in various forms for centuries. These partitions, taken together, represented one of the most consequential territorial transformations of the entire 18th century, erasing an established European state entirely from the map through the coordinated action of its more powerful neighbors. Catherine's role in this process reflected the same pragmatic, opportunistic approach to territorial expansion that had characterized her policies since the First Partition over 2 decades earlier. Whatever intellectual sympathy she retained for concepts of national sovereignty and self-determination, learned through years of correspondence with Enlightenment philosophers, did nothing to restrain her participation in the systematic dismantling of a sovereign neighboring state. Even as these partitions unfolded, events in France were generating shockwaves that reached St. Petersburg with considerable force, reshaping how Catherine and other European monarchs understood the risks facing established royal authority everywhere. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, had progressed through increasingly radical phases, culminating in the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. Catherine, who had once corresponded warmly with French philosophers whose ideas had helped inspire revolutionary sentiment, watched these developments with mounting horror rather than any lingering sympathy for reformist principles. Catherine's reaction to the French Revolution marked a significant and telling shift in her broader political outlook, distancing herself considerably from the Enlightenment associations that had once defined much of her public reputation across Europe. She severed diplomatic relations with revolutionary France and offered support to French émigrés who had fled the upheaval. Her earlier correspondence with figures like Voltaire and Diderot, once celebrated as evidence of her enlightened governance, now seemed considerably more complicated given the revolutionary chaos those same intellectual currents had apparently helped unleash in France. This ideological reversal extended into domestic policy as well, with Catherine growing increasingly suspicious of any writings or ideas that might carry revolutionary implications within her own empire. Censorship tightened noticeably during these final years of her reign, targeting works that had once circulated relatively freely among educated Russian society. Alexander Radishchev, a Russian writer whose work criticized serfdom and autocratic governance, faced severe punishment for views that might have received more tolerant treatment earlier in Catherine's reign. The Empress, who had once drafted the Nakaz, now governed with considerably less patience for ideas challenging established authority. The contrast between Catherine's earlier reformist rhetoric and her later conservative retrenchment reflected broader patterns evident throughout her entire reign, patterns that had already begun emerging following the Pugachev rebellion 2 decades earlier. Genuine crisis, whether domestic rebellion or foreign revolution, consistently pushed Catherine toward stronger assertions of centralized authority rather than toward the kind of structural reform her intellectual engagements might have once suggested. She remained throughout her reign fundamentally more committed to stability and order than to any consistent ideological program, whether reformist or conservative. Despite these anxieties regarding revolutionary contagion, Catherine's empire at this point in her reign represented an extraordinary accumulation of territory, population, and international influence, achieved through a combination of military success, diplomatic skill, and ruthless opportunism spanning more than 3 decades of rule. Russia now extended from the Baltic to the Black Sea, incorporating vast new territories acquired through the Ottoman Wars and the successive partitions of Poland. Few rulers in Russian history had expanded the empire's borders so dramatically or governed such a genuinely vast and diverse collection of peoples and territories. International perception of Russia had transformed considerably over the course of Catherine's reign, evolving from the relatively peripheral power it had represented under earlier rulers into one of the dominant forces shaping European diplomacy and territorial arrangements. Other major powers now calculated their own strategies with careful attention to Russian interests and capabilities, a shift that reflected Catherine's cumulative achievements across military, diplomatic, and administrative domains throughout her decades of rule. She had transformed Russia's standing among European powers as thoroughly as she had transformed its actual territorial boundaries. By the mid-1790s, Catherine governed an empire fundamentally different from the one she had seized through the coup that installed her 30 years earlier, larger, more centralized, and considerably more influential across European affairs than anything her predecessors had achieved. The partitions of Poland, however troubling their moral implications, had secured substantial territorial gains through relatively efficient diplomatic coordination rather than prolonged and costly warfare. The French Revolution's shockwaves had pushed her toward a more conservative and defensive posture in her final years, tempering the reformist idealism that had once characterized her earlier engagement with Enlightenment philosophy. Catherine's empire stood, by any measure, at the height of its power, even as the Empress herself entered the final years of a reign that had reshaped Russia more thoroughly than any ruler before her. Chapter 14: A Mother's Quarrel. Catherine's relationship with her son Paul had never recovered from the earliest years of his life, when Empress Elizabeth had removed the infant from Catherine's care almost immediately after birth. That initial separation established a distance between mother and son that decades of subsequent contact never fully closed. Paul grew up resentful, aware from a young age that his mother had seized the throne through a coup that ended his father's life under circumstances nobody discussed openly. This foundational wound shaped every subsequent interaction between them. As Paul matured into adulthood, his resentment toward Catherine only deepened, fueled by his exclusion from any meaningful role in governing the empire he stood to inherit. Catherine kept him deliberately distant from the actual mechanics of state administration, entrusting him with ceremonial responsibilities while denying him the substantive political education that might have prepared him for eventual rule. Paul interpreted this exclusion, not unreasonably, as evidence that his mother distrusted him fundamentally, perhaps even viewed him as an obstacle to be managed rather than an heir to be cultivated. Their correspondence during these years remained formal and strained, lacking any real warmth. Paul's own temperament complicated matters further, marked by an anxious, suspicious disposition that some historians have attributed to the psychological damage of his difficult childhood. He grew increasingly paranoid about threats to his position, convinced that Catherine might attempt to bypass him entirely in favor of naming her grandson as direct successor. This fear, while perhaps exaggerated in its specifics, was not entirely without foundation, given Catherine's evident preference for her eldest grandson over the son she had never been permitted to raise personally. Paul's suspicions, however uncomfortable for Catherine to confront, reflected a political reality she had done little to disguise. Alexander, Paul's eldest son, had been born in 1777, and Catherine involved herself in his upbringing with an intensity strikingly reminiscent of how Elizabeth had once controlled Paul's own childhood decades earlier. She removed Alexander substantially from his parents' direct care, overseeing his education personally and shaping his intellectual and political formation according to her own Enlightenment-influenced principles. This arrangement mirrored, with almost uncanny precision, the very dynamic that had once caused Catherine such pain during her own difficult relationship with Elizabeth. She seemed either unaware of this parallel or entirely unconcerned by it. Catherine's attachment to Alexander grew genuinely deep over the years, reflecting both authentic grandmotherly affection and a clear political calculation regarding the empire's future succession. She corresponded with him regularly, discussed matters of governance and philosophy in terms she rarely shared with Paul, and clearly viewed her grandson as possessing qualities better suited to eventual rule than his father displayed. Alexander, raised largely under his grandmother's influence, developed a personality and political outlook considerably more aligned with Catherine's own sensibilities than Paul's had ever managed to become. This dynamic only widened the existing rift between Catherine and her son. Rumors circulated persistently throughout the final years of Catherine's reign, suggesting that she intended to bypass Paul entirely, naming Alexander as her direct successor rather than allowing the throne to pass through the conventional line of succession. Whether Catherine seriously pursued this plan, or whether it remained merely a private consideration she never formally acted upon, has never been definitively established by surviving historical evidence. What is clear is that Paul believed the threat to be real, and this belief poisoned whatever remained of his relationship with his mother during her final years. Paul's isolation from the actual business of governance left him with considerable time to develop his own alternative vision for how Russia should be ruled, one that differed sharply from his mother's approach in both substance and style. He admired military discipline and formal hierarchy with an intensity that echoed, in some respects, his own father's earlier fascination with Prussian military culture. Paul established his own separate court at Gatchina, effectively creating a shadow government where he could exercise at least symbolic authority over matters Catherine denied him any real influence over. At Gatchina, Paul surrounded himself with officers and advisors who shared his particular interests in military organization and formal protocol, creating an environment that functioned almost as a rehearsal for the kind of rule he intended to impose once he finally succeeded to the throne. Observers who visited Kachina during these years often remarked on the stark contrast between Paul's rigid, militaristic household and the more expansive, intellectually engaged court that Catherine maintained in St. Petersburg. This contrast reflected a genuine and deepening divergence in temperament and governing philosophy between mother and son. Catherine's own writings from this period reveal relatively little direct discussion of her relationship with Paul, a silence that itself suggests considerable discomfort with a situation she seemed unable or unwilling to resolve. She focused her private correspondence and reflections more heavily on Alexander, on matters of state, and on the broader question of Russia's future direction. Paul's grievances, however legitimate they may have been, received little sympathetic attention within Catherine's own private accounting of her family relationships. The question of succession remained formally unresolved throughout these final years, creating genuine uncertainty about what would happen once Catherine's reign eventually ended. Russian law as it stood favored Paul's claim as the direct male heir, but Catherine's evident preference for Alexander introduced real ambiguity into what should have been a straightforward succession. Court officials and foreign diplomats alike speculated openly about which outcome Catherine might ultimately pursue, aware that her personal wishes could potentially override established succession practice if she chose to act decisively before her death. Paul's anxiety about this uncertain future manifested in increasingly erratic behavior as the years progressed, behavior that some observers found reminiscent, uncomfortably, of the instability that had characterized his father Peter's brief and disastrous reign decades earlier. He grew suspicious of those around him, prone to sudden changes in mood and judgment that concerned even his own supporters at Kachina. Catherine, aware of these developments, seemed to view them as further confirmation of Paul's unsuitability for rule, rather than as a crisis requiring her direct intervention or reconciliation. The estrangement between mother and son extended beyond mere political disagreement into something considerably more personal and painful, reflecting decades of accumulated resentment that neither party seemed capable of addressing directly. Paul blamed Catherine for his father's death, for his own excluded childhood, and for the ongoing uncertainty surrounding his eventual inheritance. Catherine, for her part, appeared to view Paul's grievances as evidence of a flawed character, rather than as the legitimate consequence of choices she herself had made throughout his life. Neither perspective allowed much room for the kind of reconciliation that might have eased tensions before Catherine's reign concluded. This family conflict occurred against the backdrop of Catherine's broader anxieties during these final years, anxieties intensified considerably by the ongoing shock waves of the French Revolution and her growing concern about threats to established monarchical authority throughout Europe. The prospect of an unstable, erratic successor troubled her not merely as a personal matter, but as a genuine concern for the empire's future stability. Paul's evident instability, whatever its psychological origins, seemed to Catherine like a genuine liability for an empire she had spent decades building and strengthening. Alexander himself occupied an uncomfortable position throughout this period, caught between a grandmother whose favor he had cultivated since childhood and a father whose resentment toward that very favor grew more pronounced with each passing year. He maintained careful diplomatic relationships with both, avoiding the kind of open conflict that might have forced him to choose sides definitively. This careful balancing act would serve him considerably well once he eventually succeeded to the throne himself, though that succession remained during Catherine's final years, still shrouded in genuine uncertainty. By the mid 1790s, the quarrel between Catherine and Paul had settled into a kind of permanent, unresolved tension, neither reconciled nor decisively addressed through any formal change to the established succession. Catherine continued favoring Alexander openly, while Paul continued nursing grievances at Gecina that had accumulated across an entire lifetime of exclusion and suspicion. Whatever plans Catherine may have privately entertained regarding bypassing Paul entirely remained, as her final years approached, still unrealized and undocumented in any surviving formal decree. The empire's future succession, despite decades of Catherine's careful governance in nearly every other domain, remained one of the few significant matters she left genuinely and dangerously unresolved. Chapter 15: The Final Winter. By the autumn of 1796, Catherine had ruled Russia for 34 years, longer than any monarch since Peter the Great, and the empire she governed bore little resemblance to the one she had seized through a hurried coup in her youth. She was 67 years old, still engaged actively in the daily business of governance, though her physical health had begun showing signs of the strain accumulated across decades of relentless work. Court officials noted a gradual slowing in her pace, though her mental sharpness reportedly remained largely undiminished. She continued rising early, reviewing state papers, and meeting with ministers according to a routine she had maintained for most of her reign. Her final months were occupied substantially with the ongoing tensions surrounding Paul's uncertain succession, a matter that remained formally unresolved despite years of private consideration. Catherine reportedly continued favoring the idea of Alexander inheriting the throne directly, though whatever documentation might have formalized this preference has never been definitively located by historians examining her papers. Some accounts suggest she had drafted a decree altering the succession, only for it to be destroyed or suppressed following her death. The truth of these claims remains genuinely uncertain, adding a persistent note of mystery to the final chapter of her reign. Catherine's daily life during these final months retained much of the intellectual engagement that had characterized her entire adult life, continuing her correspondence, her reading, and her attention to matters of state with evident dedication. She maintained her interest in the arts and continued expanding the collections that would eventually form the core of the Hermitage. Visitors to her court during this period generally described an empress still fully in command of her faculties, engaged with the world around her despite her advancing age. Nothing in these accounts suggested any expectation that her death was imminent. The morning of November 16th began, by most accounts, as an entirely ordinary day within Catherine's established routine. She rose early, as was her lifelong habit, and attended to her usual correspondence and administrative duties without any apparent sign of distress. Her household staff noticed nothing unusual in her demeanor or behavior during these early hours. The day proceeded much like countless others across her long reign, giving no warning of what was about to unfold. Later that morning, Catherine suffered what modern medical understanding would likely identify as a severe stroke, collapsing in circumstances that her household staff discovered only some time afterward. She was found unconscious, and physicians summoned immediately determined that her condition was extremely grave. The suddenness of the collapse shocked a court that had witnessed no clear warning signs in the days and weeks preceding it. An empress who had governed with such sustained vigor for over 3 decades now lay incapacitated, her condition rapidly deteriorating beyond any hope of recovery. Word spread quickly through the palace and beyond, generating the kind of urgent, anxious activity that inevitably accompanies the impending death of a reigning monarch. Paul was summoned immediately from Gachina, arriving to find his mother unconscious and beyond meaningful communication. The physical distance that had defined their relationship for decades now gave way in these final hours to the simple reality of a son arriving to await his mother's death. Whatever reconciliation might have been possible between them, none occurred during these final silent hours. Catherine never regained consciousness after her collapse, lingering for roughly a day in a state from which recovery was never realistically possible, according to the physicians attending her. Her breathing grew increasingly labored as the hours passed, and those gathered around her understood that the end was approaching steadily. Alexander, too, was present during these final hours, watching alongside his father as the grandmother who had shaped so much of his upbringing approached her death. The atmosphere within the palace grew heavier with each passing hour. She died on November 17th, 1796, without regaining consciousness, bringing to a close a reign that had reshaped Russia more thoroughly than perhaps any ruler since Peter the Great himself. The news spread rapidly across St. Petersburg and then across the wider empire, generating the formal expressions of mourning appropriate to the death of a monarch who had ruled for so many decades. Church bells tolled across the capital, and official announcements confirmed what had already become widely known through informal channels. An era in Russian history had reached its definitive end. Paul's accession followed immediately upon his mother's death, and he moved with notable speed to assert his authority and to reverse or alter policies associated with her lengthy reign. Among his early actions was a formal change to the laws governing succession, establishing clear rules of primogeniture intended to prevent exactly the kind of uncertainty that had shadowed his own path to the throne. This reform reflected quite directly the accumulated resentment and anxiety Paul had carried throughout the years of his exclusion and uncertain status under his mother's rule. Paul also took the unusual step of arranging a formal reburial for his father, Peter III, whose remains had lain for decades without the imperial honors his brief and troubled reign had never received in death. He had Peter's remains exhumed and reburied alongside Catherine's, in a ceremony that pointedly emphasized the connection between father and son that Catherine's coup had originally severed. This gesture carried unmistakable symbolic weight, a son's belated assertion of loyalty toward the father whose death had enabled his mother's decades of rule. Historians have generally read the ceremony as Paul's deliberate public rebuke of the mother who had excluded him for so long. News of Catherine's death traveled across Europe over the following weeks, prompting considerable reflection among foreign courts and diplomats regarding the legacy of a ruler who had reshaped the continent's balance of power so significantly during her long reign. Obituaries and official statements acknowledged the scale of her achievements, even as private assessments often remained more mixed, reflecting ongoing ambivalence about the methods she had employed to seize and maintain power. Few, however, disputed the sheer scope of what she had accomplished across 34 years of rule. The empire Catherine left behind bore little resemblance to the one she had inherited through her hurried coup in 1762. transformed almost beyond recognition through decades of territorial expansion, administrative reform, and sustained engagement with the broader currents of European intellectual and political life. Russia's borders now extended along the Black Sea coast and deep into former Polish territory, incorporating millions of new subjects and vast new resources into an empire that had grown dramatically under her direction. Few rulers in Russian history had expanded the state's physical boundaries so extensively across a single reign. Beyond mere territorial expansion, Catherine had reshaped Russian governance, culture, and international standing in ways that would influence the empire for generations following her death. Her patronage of the arts had established collections and institutions that would endure for centuries. Her engagement with Enlightenment philosophy, however inconsistently applied in practice, had helped position Russia within broader European intellectual currents in ways that previous rulers had never fully achieved. Her military and diplomatic successes had transformed how other European powers understood and calculated Russian strength and ambition. Her personal legacy remained, and continues to remain, considerably more complicated than her territorial and administrative achievements might suggest on their own. She had seized power through a coup that ended in her husband's suspicious death, maintained and even expanded an institution of serfdom she privately recognized as unjust, and ultimately retreated from the reformist idealism that had characterized her earlier years once genuine crisis revealed its practical limitations. These contradictions, present throughout her reign, ensured that assessments of her legacy would remain genuinely divided among historians examining her life in the centuries that followed. What remains undeniable, whatever judgment one reaches regarding the moral complexities of her rule, is the sheer scale of transformation Catherine achieved across 34 years on the Russian throne. She had arrived in Russia as a 14-year-old foreign princess with no claim to power beyond a bloodline connection useful to others' political calculations. She died as one of the most consequential rulers in Russian history, having doubled the empire's territory, reshaped its institutions, and secured its standing among the dominant powers of Europe. The minor princess from Stettin had become, by any measure, an empress whose reign would echo through Russian history for generations to come. Snow was already falling over St. Petersburg by the time word of her death reached the outer edges of the city, settling quietly over rooftops that had watched 3 decades of her rule pass beneath them. It falls there still, most winters, in the same patient, unhurried way, gathering along windowsills and the branches of trees planted long after she was gone. Winters in that part of the world have their own rhythm, indifferent to the reigns of empresses or the ambitions of empires, arriving each year regardless of what has changed in the world below them. There is something in the turning of seasons that outlasts every court, every coronation, every carefully drafted treaty. The Neva freezes and thaws each year with the same patient regularity it has always kept, unconcerned with whichever name happens to sit on the throne beside it. Rivers do this everywhere, actually, moving through the lives of the people living along their banks with a kind of vast, unhurried indifference that can be strangely comforting once you notice it. Think of a night somewhere cold and quiet, snow accumulating slowly on a windowsill, the kind of silence that only comes after the last sound of the day has finally settled. A candle, if there still is one, burns low, its light shrinking gradually toward the wax. Outside, everything holds still. This is the kind of stillness that has always existed in one form or another, long before palaces and long after they crumble. There is a particular kind of rest that comes only at the end of a long effort, the kind Catherine herself might have recognized after so many decades of vigilance, correspondence, calculation, and quiet endurance. It is the rest of someone who has finally set something down, not triumph exactly, and not defeat either, just the simple release that comes when a long labor is at last complete. Snow continues falling, as it always has, over rivers and rooftops and the quiet corners of old cities that have seen empires rise and settle into history. It falls without any particular urgency, without any need to be somewhere else. It simply falls, softly, the way it has always fallen, covering everything evenly, indifferent to whatever lies beneath it. Somewhere, a fire is burning low in a hearth, its warmth thinning into embers that no longer need tending. The room around it has gone dark and still, holding on to just enough heat to feel safe rather than cold. This is the kind of quiet found at the very end of long winters, when the worst of the cold has already passed and something gentler has begun to settle in its place. And somewhere else, snow is simply falling on an empty bench beneath old trees, gathering slowly along its wooden slats, undisturbed by footsteps or voices. No one is there to see it. It falls anyway, the way it always has, the way it always will, quiet and steady and entirely its own.